Welcome to Bleak Fears. Tonight we're descending into the heart of Appalachia, where ancient mountains guard secrets that shatter reality itself. What happens when experienced professionals encounter something that defies every logical explanation? When respected community members vanish without trace? When the very ground beneath our feet hums with impossible frequencies? These 11 true accounts will make you question everything you thought you knew about these haunted hills. Hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear will change how you see the wilderness forever. Let's begin. My name is Sullivan, and I'm 34 years old. I work as a geological surveyor, which means I spend most of my days crawling through abandoned mines, checking their structural integrity, and mapping out tunnels that haven't seen daylight in decades. It's solitary work, and most people think it's dangerous, but I've always felt at home in the dark. The earth has a rhythm to it, a predictability that I find comforting. At least, that's what I believed until September 2019, when I took a contract job in Beckley, West Virginia, and discovered that some things buried in these mountains should stay buried. The job seemed routine enough. A remediation company hired me to survey an old coal mine in Raleigh County that had been abandoned since 1983. They wanted to know if the shaft system was stable enough to warrant cleanup work, or if they should just seal it permanently and walk away. I'd done 100 surveys just like this one. I packed my equipment, drove down from Pittsburgh, and met with the site manager on a gray Tuesday morning that smelled like rain and diesel fuel. The mine entrance was exactly what I expected. Rusted rails disappearing into darkness, wooden support beams gone soft with rot, and that particular smell that all old mines have. A mixture of stale air, mineral deposits, and something else I've never been able to name. Cold stone and time, maybe. I checked my gear one last time, tested my headlamp and backup lights, made sure my radio was charged, even though I knew it wouldn't work once I got deep enough. Then I stepped into the mountain. The first 500 feet were unremarkable. I took measurements, photographed support structures, made notes about water seepage and roof stability. The tunnel sloped downward at a steady angle, and my footsteps echoed off walls that had been carved out by men who were probably dead now. I thought about them sometimes, those miners. What it must have been like to spend your whole life in the dark, breathing coal dust, knowing the mountain could crush you at any moment. It made my job seem easy by comparison. Around 600 feet down, I noticed the temperature dropping. That wasn't unusual. Mines often have cold spots where air flows in from other passages, but this felt different. It wasn't just cold. It was a bone-deep chill that seemed to come from the stone itself, like the walls were radiating, cold instead of absorbing it. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept moving. I had a job to do. At 800 feet, I heard it for the first time. A sound so faint I almost missed it beneath my own breathing and footsteps. I stopped walking and held perfectly still, and there it was again. A low humming, almost musical, like someone running their finger around the rim of a wine glass. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the mine, from somewhere below me, even though the tunnel continued straight ahead. I checked my equipment, thinking maybe something was malfunctioning, but everything looked normal. The sound persisted, steady and rhythmic. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct I'd developed over 12 years of underground work was screaming at me that something was wrong. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I told myself I was being irrational. Old mines make strange noises, air moving through cracks in the rock, water dripping in distant chambers, the mountain settling. Nothing supernatural about it. I kept walking. The humming grew louder as I descended. It started to resonate in my chest, vibrating through my rib cage like I was standing next to a massive speaker. But it wasn't painful, exactly. It was almost pleasant, in a way that made my skin crawl. My headlamp began to flicker, and when I checked my compass, the needle was spinning slowly, unable to find north. I marked the wall with chalk, a surveyor's habit, so I could find my way back, and pressed forward. That's when I found the chamber. It wasn't on any of the mind maps I'd studied. The tunnel opened suddenly into a space so large my headlamp couldn't find the far wall. But what caught my attention immediately were the formations covering every surface. Crystalline structures, thousands of them, growing from the walls and ceiling like frozen waterfalls. They looked almost like quartz, but the color was wrong. A deep blue-black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And they were moving. Not quickly, but definitely moving, pulsing slowly like they were breathing. The humming was coming from them. I could see it now, the way the crystals vibrated in perfect synchronization, creating harmonics that shouldn't have been possible. I'm not a musician, but I know enough about physics to understand that what I was hearing violated several laws of acoustics. The frequencies were layered in ways that natural formations simply can't produce. It sounded almost deliberate, almost like a song. I pulled out my audio recorder with shaking hands and started documenting everything. My voice on the playback later would sound calm and professional, but I remember feeling a growing sense of dread that I couldn't explain. The air in the chamber tasted metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with something organic and ancient that reminded me of turning over rocks in a forest and finding the pale things that live underneath. My throat felt coated with it. I approached the nearest wall of crystals and reached out carefully, not quite touching them. The cold radiating from them was intense, penetrating through my thermal gloves. But worse than the cold was the sensation of vibration I could feel without making contact, like standing too close to high-voltage power lines. The humming was so loud now it drowned out my own thoughts. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was physical, pressing against me from all directions. That's when I noticed the floor. The chamber floor wasn't solid rock like it should have been. In the center, there was a depression, almost perfectly circular. And when I shined my light into it, I couldn't see the bottom. Just darkness going down and down, far deeper than this mine was supposed to extend. The humming was coming from down there, from somewhere in those depths, and it was getting louder, stronger, like whatever was making it knew I was there and was responding. I backed away slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. My equipment was going crazy now. My digital camera's display showed nothing but static. My GPS couldn't find any satellites, even though I was only 800 feet down, and my audio recorder, which I'd left running in my pocket, was picking up frequencies that shouldn't have existed. Sounds far below and far above the range of human hearing. Sounds that would later make audio technicians shake their heads and suggest my equipment was faulty. I turned and ran. I don't remember much of the trip back to the surface, except the sound of my own breathing and the feeling that something vast and incomprehensible was waking up beneath me, disturbed after however many thousands or millions of years it had been sleeping. The humming followed me all the way to the entrance, fading only when I finally stumbled out into the overcast afternoon and fell to my knees on the gravel, gasping for air that didn't taste like metal and age. I reported everything to the site manager. I showed him my equipment readings, played him the audio despite the way it made my skin crawl to hear it again. He listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with each detail. Then he made a phone call to someone whose name he didn't share, spoke in quiet tones I couldn't quite hear, and told me my services were no longer required. They paid me in full plus a substantial bonus, handed me a non-disclosure agreement that I signed without reading, and asked me to forget I'd ever been there. 3 days later, I drove past the mine site on my way out of town. The entrance was sealed with fresh concrete, and armed security guards were turning away anyone who tried to approach. The official story, according to local news, was that the mine was structurally unsound and posed a danger to the public. But I knew better. I'd seen their faces, heard the fear in their voices when they told me to leave and never come back. I still have the audio recording. I've never shared it with anyone, but I listen to it sometimes late at night when I can't sleep. The humming is still there, exactly as I remember it. Those impossible harmonics that sound almost like a language I'm not equipped to understand. And underneath it, if you listen carefully enough, there's something else. A rhythm. A pattern. Something that sounds almost like a heartbeat. Slow and patient and utterly alien. I don't do underground surveys anymore. I found a new job doing topographical mapping, staying above ground where the sun can reach me. But sometimes, when I'm standing on a mountain or walking through the woods, I feel that same vibration through the soles of my feet. That same humming just at the edge of hearing. And I wonder what else is down there in the dark beneath Appalachia, waiting in chambers that aren't on any map, singing songs that humans were never meant to hear. The mine is still sealed as far as I know, but the humming hasn't stopped. I know because on quiet nights, when the wind is right, I swear I can still hear it. My name is Evangeline, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a veterinary technician at a small animal clinic in Whitesburg, Kentucky, right in the heart of Letcher County. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where we treat more farm animals than house pets, and where the most exciting thing that usually happens is delivering a litter of puppies at 3 in the morning. I've always loved animals, ever since I was a little girl bringing home strays and nursing injured birds back to health. I thought I'd seen everything there was to see in my line of work. Then July 2004 happened, and I learned that some things wearing fur and walking on 4 legs aren't animals at all. It was a Thursday night, and I'd volunteered to close up the clinic so my boss could get home to his family. We'd had a slow day, just routine checkups and vaccinations, and I was looking forward to finishing the paperwork and heading home myself. The clinic sits on the edge of town, surrounded by fields on 3 sides and the woods on the 4th. During the day, it's peaceful, but at night it gets dark in a way that city people don't understand. The kind of dark where your headlights are the only light for miles. I was in the back office around 9:30, updating patient files on our ancient computer, when I heard a vehicle pull into the gravel parking lot. We didn't have any appointments scheduled, but emergencies happen, especially out here where the nearest 24-hour veterinary hospital is over an hour away. I walked to the front desk and looked through the window. A pickup truck I didn't recognize sat idling in the lot, headlights still on. A man got out, went around to the passenger side, and lifted something out. Something wrapped in a blanket. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The July air was thick and humid, heavy with the smell of cut grass and distant rain. The man walked toward me, carrying his bundle carefully, and in the harsh fluorescent light from the clinic sign, I could see he was maybe 60 years old, wearing overalls and work boots caked with mud. His face had that weathered look that comes from spending your whole life outdoors. But it was his eyes that struck me. They were wrong somehow, too wide, too bright, like he was running on adrenaline or fear or something else entirely. He told me his dog had been hurt, said it got tangled in some wire fencing out on his property, and he needed me to take a look. I led him inside to the examination room and told him to set the animal on the table. He laid down the blanket bundle with a gentleness that seemed genuine, then stepped back quickly, wiping his hands on his overalls like he'd touched something unclean. That should have been my first warning. I pulled back the blanket, and my breath caught in my throat. The creature lying on my examination table was roughly dog-shaped. I'll give it that much. It had 4 legs, a tail, a head that was vaguely canine, but that's where the similarities ended. It was completely hairless, its skin a mottled gray pink that looked diseased and wrong, but worse than the hairlessness were its paws. They weren't paws at all, they were hands. Not quite human, but not animal either, with elongated fingers that ended in thick black nails that looked more like claws. And when it opened its mouth to pant, I saw teeth that belonged in a person's skull, not a dog's muzzle. I stepped back from the table, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The man was already moving toward the door, and when I called after him to wait, to tell me what this thing actually was, He just shook his head and said he'd be back in the morning to pick it up. Then he was gone, his truck peeling out of the parking lot so fast gravel sprayed against the building. I should have called someone right then. Animal control, the police, my boss, anyone. But I was frozen, staring at this creature that was staring back at me with eyes that held far too much intelligence. It wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound, just watching me with an intensity that made every hair on my body stand up. The smell coming off it was overwhelming, a combination of infection and wet animal musk that made me gag. I backed toward the door slowly, planning to lock the creature in the exam room and call for help. That's when it moved. Not like a dog, not like any animal I'd ever seen. It rolled off the table with deliberate, calculated precision and landed on all fours, those hand-like paws making a wet slapping sound on the linoleum. Then it looked directly at me and made a noise I'll never forget. It sounded like it was trying to speak, like it was forming words with vocal cords that weren't designed for human speech. The sound that came out was a horrible mixture of growling and something that almost sounded like my name. I ran. I slammed the exam room door and heard it hit the door from the other side with enough force to rattle the frame. I fumbled with my phone, trying to dial while backing down the hallway toward the office. That's when the lights went out, all of them simultaneously, plunging the clinic into absolute darkness. The emergency exit signs provided just enough red glow to see shapes, shadows, nothing more. I could hear it in the exam room, hear it doing something to the door, not scratching like a dog would. I heard the doorknob rattling, heard it turning. It was opening the door. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my phone, heard it skitter across the floor and disappear under a cabinet. The exam room door creaked open. I felt my way down the hallway in the dark, my shoulder brushing against the wall, my breathing so loud it drowned out everything else. I made it to the supply room and slipped inside, closing the door as quietly as I could and turning the lock. It was a flimsy lock, the kind meant to keep staff out of controlled medications, not to keep anything in or out with serious intent. But it was all I had. I crouched in the corner behind shelves of supplies and tried to think. My phone was gone. The clinic phone was in the office at the other end of the building. The nearest house was half a mile away, across an open field. I was trapped, and that thing was loose in the building with me. I could hear it moving through the clinic. Not running, not rushing. It was methodical, systematic, checking each room in sequence. I heard it in the reception area, heard supplies being knocked over. I heard it in the surgical suite, heard metal instruments clattering to the floor. And always, I could hear those wet footsteps, those hand paws slapping against the floor as it searched. It found the supply room door and stopped. I could see its shadow in the crack beneath the door, could hear it breathing on the other side. Then it did something that made my blood turn to ice. It knocked. 3 deliberate knocks, exactly the way a person would knock on a door. Then it made that sound again, that horrible attempt at speech, and this time I could almost make out words. It was calling my name. It had heard the man use my name when we first spoke, and now it was calling me. The doorknob started to turn. The lock held for maybe 5 seconds before I heard it snap. The door swung open, and there it was, silhouetted in the red glow from the exit sign. It stood on its hind legs now, fully upright like a person, and it was taller than me. Those hand paws reached toward me, and I grabbed the first thing I could find, a pair of surgical scissors from the shelf beside me. What happened next was pure instinct and terror. It lunged, and I stabbed, feeling the scissors sink into flesh that was too warm and too soft. It made a sound, a shriek that was part animal and part something else, and stumbled backward. I pushed past it and ran for the front door, not caring about the darkness, not caring about anything except getting out. I was fumbling with the front door lock when I heard sirens. Beautiful, wonderful sirens getting closer. I'd never been so happy to see red and blue lights in my entire life. 2 police cars pulled into the lot, and officers got out with their weapons drawn. I was screaming, pointing back toward the clinic, trying to explain what was inside. They found it in the hallway, bleeding from the wound I'd given it, trying to crawl toward the back exit. They shot it when it turned toward them with those teeth bared. The sound of the gunshots in that enclosed space was deafening, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with that awful musk the creature produced. What came after was worse, in some ways. The investigation revealed things I wish I'd never learned. The man who brought it in owned property deep in a holler, about 20 miles from the clinic. When police searched his land, they found 9 more of these things, kept in cages made from chain link and rebar. Some were dead, some were dying, and some were alive, crawling over each other in those filthy pens, making sounds that still wake me up at night. The man had been breeding them for over 30 years, started with regular dogs, then began inbreeding them in ways that should have been impossible, selecting for traits that pushed them further and further from anything natural. He'd been keeping detailed records, playing at being some kind of twisted geneticist, creating animals that were more monster than pet. The prosecutor said it was one of the worst cases of animal cruelty the state had ever seen. They charged him with dozens of crimes: animal cruelty, reckless endangerment, keeping dangerous animals without permits. He went to prison, and they destroyed all the creatures he'd created, every single one. They said it was the only humane thing to do, that these animals couldn't be rehabilitated or rehomed, that they were too dangerous, too damaged, too far gone. I testified at his trial, had to sit in that courtroom and describe what happened, had to look at photographs of those things and confirm that yes, that was what attacked me. The defense tried to argue that they were just dogs, just animals, that what happened was an unfortunate accident caused by poor training. But the jury saw the photos. They heard the expert testimony about the genetic abnormalities, about the deliberate breeding program designed to create something that shouldn't exist. They convicted him on every count. I don't work at that clinic anymore. Don't work with animals at all now, actually. I got a job doing medical billing from home, something where I don't have to touch or interact with anything living. My therapist says I'm making progress, that the nightmares are getting less frequent. But I still can't be around dogs. Can't stand the sound of claws on hardwood floors. Can't handle being in the dark without multiple lights on. Sometimes I think about what that man created in his isolation and madness. How he took something that should have been loyal and loving and twisted it into something that wore the shape of a dog but moved like it was learning how to be human. How it tried to speak, how it opened doors, how it hunted me through that clinic with a deliberate intelligence that no animal should possess. The worst part, the thing that really keeps me up at night, is wondering if he succeeded. If what he created actually was something new, something that bridged the gap between animal and human in all the worst possible ways. The scientists who examined the remains never gave straight answers about what they found. They used words like unprecedented and anomalous, spoke in careful academic language that avoided the real question underneath it all. What do you call something that looks like an animal but thinks like it might be something more? What do you call the space between dog and human, between pet and predator, between the natural world and whatever exists beyond it? I don't have answers. All I have are the scars on my arms where it grabbed me, and the memory of those eyes looking at me with understanding that shouldn't have been there. All I have is the knowledge that somewhere in these Kentucky hills, in some isolated holler where neighbors are miles away and nobody asks too many questions, someone decided to play God with things that should have been left alone. And I have to live with the fact that it worked. My name is Reese, and I'm 41 years old. I've been driving long-haul trucks for the past 18 years, ever since I got out of the Army and needed work that let me be alone with my thoughts. I've driven every highway and back road between here and the Canadian border, logged over 2 million miles without a single accident, and I've seen just about everything you can see from behind a windshield. Or at least, that's what I thought until December 2021, when I picked up a hitchhiker on Route 23 in Pike County, Kentucky, and learned that some roads carry more than just living passengers. It was one of those brutal winter nights where the cold goes straight through your coat and into your bones. Snow had been falling since late afternoon, not heavy enough to shut down the roads, but steady enough to make driving treacherous. I was hauling auto parts from Detroit down to a distribution center in Tennessee, running about 2 hours behind schedule because of the weather. The roads were nearly empty, just me and the occasional plow truck, and I was fighting to stay alert after 14 hours behind the wheel. I saw her standing on the shoulder around 10:30 at night, right where Route 23 curves through some of the loneliest country in eastern Kentucky. She was maybe 20 years old, wearing a light jacket that looked wholly inadequate for the weather, and she had her thumb out in the universal sign for needing a ride. Now, I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. Company policy forbids it, and besides, you never know who you're letting into your cab these days. But something about seeing her out there in the snow in the middle of nowhere with no houses or gas stations for miles made me hit the brakes. I pulled over and leaned across to open the passenger door. She climbed in without a word, brushing snow from her hair and shoulders. Up close, I could see she was younger than I'd first thought. Maybe 18 or 19, with dark hair and pale skin and eyes that seemed to look right through me. Her clothes struck me as odd, not just because they were too light for winter, but because they looked old-fashioned somehow. The cut of her jacket, the style of her jeans, even her shoes looked like something from decades ago. I asked where she was headed, and she gave me an address in Pikeville, about 30 miles down the road. Her voice was quiet, barely audible over the rumble of the diesel engine, and she spoke slowly, like she was choosing each word carefully. I told her I could get her close, that my route took me right past Pikeville, and she nodded and settled back into the seat. Then she went silent, staring out at the falling snow with an expression I couldn't quite read. The first thing I noticed was the cold. Even with the heater running full blast, the temperature in the cab seemed to drop the moment she got in. I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air, could feel the cold seeping through my heavy jacket. I reached over to adjust the thermostat, thinking maybe something was wrong with the heating system, but the controls showed it was working fine, pushing out air that should have been warm but felt ice cold instead. The second thing I noticed was the smell, or rather the absence of smell. Everyone has a scent, even if it's just the smell of soap or fabric softener or the cigarette they smoked an hour ago. But she had no smell at all, nothing. Just this complete absence where a living person should have left some trace of themselves in the enclosed space of the truck cab. I tried to make conversation, the way you do when you're stuck with a stranger for 30 miles. Asked her if she lived in Pikeville, if she had family there, what she was doing out on the highway in a snowstorm. She answered in that same quiet voice, giving responses that were technically answers, but revealed nothing. Yes, she knew the area. No, she didn't mind the cold. She was just trying to get home. About 15 miles into the drive, I glanced in my rearview mirror to check the trailer, and that's when I felt my stomach drop. The mirror showed my face, showed the dark road behind us, showed the falling snow illuminated by my taillights, but it didn't show her. The passenger seat appeared empty in the reflection, even though I could see her sitting right there when I looked directly at her. I jerked my eyes back to the passenger seat, and she was still there, still staring out the window, like nothing was wrong. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I told myself I was seeing things, that I was exhausted, and the weird lighting in the cab was playing tricks on my eyes. But when I checked the mirror again, the result was the same. Empty seat. No reflection, like she wasn't really there at all. That's when she started talking, really talking, and what she said made the cold in the cab feel like nothing compared to the ice that formed in my chest. She began describing an accident in perfect, horrible detail. A semi-truck jackknifing on black ice, the way it slid sideways across both lanes. The sound of metal tearing and glass shattering. The smell of diesel fuel spreading across frozen asphalt. The way the fuel ignited, turning the wreckage into an inferno that burned so hot it melted the snow for 50 feet in every direction. She described it like she'd been there, like she'd witnessed every second of it. But the details she was giving, the specific things she was saying, they were familiar in a way that made my mouth go dry. The location, about 5 miles ahead on this same stretch of Route 23. The date, December 1987. The truck, a blue Peterbilt hauling steel beams. And the driver, a man named Robert, who'd been trying to get home to his family before Christmas. Robert was my father. He died in that accident when I was 7 years old. I'd spent years trying to learn the details of what happened that night, reading police reports and talking to witnesses, trying to understand how a man who'd driven trucks for 20 years could lose control and die on a road he'd driven 1,000 times. And now this girl, this stranger, who couldn't have been alive in 1987, was describing his death like she'd watched it happen. I asked her how she knew these things. My voice came out shaky, and I could feel sweat running down my back despite the freezing temperature in the cab. She turned to look at me for the first time since getting in the truck, and her eyes were infinitely sad, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with her young face. She told me she was there that night, told me she was always there, on this road, in this weather, trying to get home. She'd been a passenger in a car that got caught in the same accident that killed my father. Her name was on the police report too, listed among the fatalities. She was 17 years old in 1987, and she'd been dead for 34 years. The address she'd given me was coming up, and I pulled over on the shoulder, right in front of a small house set back from the road. The porch light was on, and I could see Christmas decorations in the windows, warm and inviting against the cold December night. She reached for the door handle, and I found my voice enough to ask her why. Why was she still here, still hitchhiking this road, still trying to get home after all these years? She paused with her hand on the door and looked back at me. She said she didn't know, said she remembered the accident, remembered the impact and the fire and the cold that came after, but she didn't remember dying. One moment she was trapped in the burning wreckage, and the next she was standing on the shoulder of the road with her thumb out, and it was snowing, and trucks kept passing without stopping. She'd been trying to get home ever since, getting rides from people who could see her, though most couldn't, and every time someone dropped her off at this address, she'd walk up to the door and fade away before she could knock, and then she'd be back on the roadside again, waiting for the next ride. She climbed out of the truck and closed the door gently. I watched her walk toward the house, her figure getting smaller and less distinct with each step. By the time she reached the porch, she was translucent, barely visible against the falling snow. Then she was gone completely, vanished like she'd never existed at all. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, watching the empty porch. Eventually I got out and walked up to the house myself. The Christmas decorations were old, I could see that now. Lights that hadn't been replaced in years, a wreath that was faded and brittle with age. I knocked on the door, and an elderly woman answered, looking confused to see a stranger on her porch at nearly midnight in a snowstorm. I asked if she knew anything about a girl who died in 1987, about the accident on Route 23. Her face went pale, and she invited me inside. Over coffee that I desperately needed, she told me about her daughter, about how she'd been coming home from a friend's house that December night, riding with a neighbor who'd offered to drive her rather than let her take the bus, about how they'd gotten caught in the multi-vehicle pileup when a truck lost control on the ice, about how the neighbor's car had been crushed between two semis, and neither of them survived. She showed me a photograph, and my hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the frame. It was her. The same girl, the same face, the same dark hair and pale skin. The photo was dated 1987, and in it she was smiling, alive, with her whole future ahead of her. The woman told me other truck drivers had stopped over the years. Not many, maybe one every few years, but always in December, always after picking up a girl matching her daughter's description on Route 23. Always bringing the same story about a passenger who knew impossible things about an accident she shouldn't remember. The woman had stopped being surprised by it years ago. She said she thought maybe her daughter was still trying to come home, still trying to complete that last journey that death had interrupted. I left the woman my number and told her to call if she ever needed anything. Then I climbed back in my truck and sat there in the cold, trying to process what had just happened. The cab still felt freezing, and when I checked the passenger seat, there was a thin layer of frost covering the upholstery where she'd been sitting, frost that was slowly melting now that she was gone. I finished my delivery that night, or rather early the next morning, filed my logs, got my paperwork signed, and drove home in a daze. I've made that run down Route 23 maybe 50 times since then, and I've seen her twice more. Once in the spring of 2022, and once last winter. Both times I stopped and picked her up. Both times she described my father's accident in perfect detail, and both times she vanished when I dropped her at that house in Pikeville. I don't know why she appears to me specifically. Maybe it's because my father died in the same accident that killed her. Maybe we're connected somehow, bound together by that terrible night on the ice. Or maybe I'm just one of the few people who can see her, who has whatever sense or sensitivity it takes to perceive someone caught between being gone and being home. I asked around, talked to other drivers who run that route regularly. Most of them haven't seen anything unusual, but a handful over the years, they've had similar experiences. A girl matching her description, hitching on Route 23 in the winter, always trying to get to the same address in Pikeville, always disappearing before she reaches the door. The woman at the house, the mother, she died 2 years ago. I went to the funeral, felt like I owed her that much after the conversation we'd had. The house is empty now, up for sale with a realtor's sign in the yard, but I still see the girl sometimes, still trying to get home to a place that no longer exists, to a mother who's no longer waiting. I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore, haven't since that first night. The only exception is her, when I see her standing on that snowy shoulder, with her thumb out and her old-fashioned clothes and her eyes that look through time instead of at it. I'll always stop for her, always give her that ride home she's been trying to complete for 34 years. Maybe someday she'll make it all the way to the door. Maybe someday she'll be able to knock, and someone will answer, and she'll finally be able to rest. Until then, she's out there on Route 23, waiting for the next driver who can see her, still trying to get home through the December snow. And I'll keep driving, keep watching for her, keep offering what small comfort a ride can provide to someone who's been traveling for far too long. My name is Cairo, and I'm 52 years old. I spent 30 years working as a nurse in emergency rooms across Tennessee before I retired last year. I thought retirement would mean rest, but the truth is I didn't know what to do with myself without the structure of shift work and the purpose that came from helping people in crisis. That's why I started volunteering at the crisis hotline in Johnson City. 3 nights a week, I'd sit alone in a small office in Washington County, answering calls from people who needed someone to listen. I thought I was prepared for anything after 3 decades in emergency medicine. I thought I'd heard every kind of pain a human voice could carry. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. March 2015 was unusually cold, even for the mountains. I remember because the heating in the crisis center office barely worked, and I'd taken to bringing extra layers and a space heater that I'd prop up under the desk. The overnight shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, and most nights I'd get maybe 5 or 6 calls. People in crisis, people contemplating suicide, people who just needed to hear another human voice in the darkest hours. The training had been extensive, teaching us how to listen without judgment, how to assess risk, how to connect callers with resources. But no amount of training prepares you for the actual weight of holding someone's life in your words. The first call from him came on a Tuesday night in early March. The phone rang at 1:17 in the morning, and I answered the way I always did, stating the hotline name and asking how I could help. There was silence on the other end, just breathing, and I waited patiently. Sometimes people needed time to find their words. Then he spoke, and his voice was calm, almost pleasant, describing in careful detail exactly how he planned to end his life. I went through the protocols, asked if he was in immediate danger, if he had the means readily available, if he'd made previous attempts. He answered every question with an unsettling precision, like he'd thought through every angle, planned every step. But when I asked for his name so I could help him, he refused. Said names didn't matter. Said he just wanted someone to know, to bear witness to his decision. I spent 40 minutes trying to build rapport, trying to find any opening that might let me help him reconsider, but eventually he thanked me for listening and hung up. I filed the required report, documented everything about the call. The supervisor said I'd done everything right, that sometimes you can't save everyone, that all we could do was be there when people reached out. But the call bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate. Something about his voice, about the calm certainty in it, felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the content of what he was saying. He called back 3 nights later. Same time, 1:17 in the morning, like he'd set an alarm. This time he went further with the details, describing not just his plan but his reasoning. And then, in the middle of his monologue, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. He mentioned my cat, described her perfectly, down to the white patch on her left ear, said he'd noticed her sitting in my window earlier that evening. But I'd never mentioned having a cat, had never given any personal information during our conversation. I asked him how he knew about my cat, and he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, more like he found my surprise amusing. He said he knew lots of things about me. Knew what I'd had for dinner that night, chicken and rice that I'd eaten standing at my kitchen counter because I was too tired to sit down. Knew that I'd changed the sheets on my bed that afternoon, blue ones, replacing the green ones I'd been using. Knew about the photo on my nightstand, the one of my daughter at her college graduation. My hands started shaking. I tried to keep my voice steady, tried to maintain the professional distance we were trained to preserve, but fear was creeping in around the edges. I asked him directly if he was watching me, if he'd been to my house. He said watching was such a limited word for what he was doing. Said he was paying attention. That was all. Just paying attention to the woman who'd been so kind as to listen to him. The call lasted over an hour. By the end, he was describing the interior of my home in detail, the crack in the ceiling above my bathroom sink, the way my front door stuck and required a firm push to close, the squeaky board in my hallway, third one from the bedroom. Things you could only know from being inside my house, from watching me live my daily life. When he finally hung up, I sat in that cold office shaking so hard I thought I might be sick. I called the police, filed a report about stalking. They took it seriously, sent an officer to check my house and take a statement, but there was no evidence of forced entry, no signs that anyone had been inside. They increased patrols in my neighborhood and told me to be vigilant, to call immediately if I saw anything suspicious. I should have quit the hotline right then, should have walked away and never looked back. But I kept thinking about all the people who needed help, about how my fear shouldn't prevent me from doing something that mattered. So I went back for my next shift, telling myself it was probably just someone who knew me, someone from the neighborhood playing a sick joke. He called again the following week, 1:17 in the morning, exactly on schedule. This time he started describing my day before I'd even come to the hotline office. Knew that I'd gone grocery shopping that afternoon, knew what I'd bought. Knew that I'd stopped for gas and paid cash instead of using my credit card. Knew that I'd argued with a customer service representative on the phone about a billing error. Things no one could know unless they were following me, unless they were watching my every move. But worse than the specific details was what he started saying about my thoughts. He described the anxiety I'd felt that morning when I couldn't find my car keys. Described the moment of sadness that had hit me when I'd seen a mother and daughter laughing together in the grocery store. Reminded of my own daughter who lived 3 states away. described the exact thought I'd had while driving to the hotline office that night, wondering if I was losing my mind. I stopped sleeping. Would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound, wondering if he was out there in the darkness, watching my windows. I changed my locks, installed cameras, started varying my routine. But the calls kept coming, and he kept knowing things he shouldn't know. Not just about my actions, but about my internal state, my feelings, my private thoughts that I'd never spoken aloud. The other volunteers at the hotline started noticing changes in me. I was jumpy, paranoid, losing weight because I couldn't keep food down. My supervisor suggested I take a break, but I couldn't explain why that felt impossible. If I stopped answering, who would he call? What would he do if he couldn't reach me during his appointed time? By the 4th week, I was barely functioning. The calls had taken on a surreal quality, blurring the line between his voice and my own thoughts. He'd describe things before they happened. Would tell me I was about to sneeze, and then I would. Would tell me I was thinking about calling my daughter, and I'd realize my hand was already reaching for the phone. It was like he was inside my head narrating my life from some impossible vantage point that existed both outside and within me. I started wondering if I was having a breakdown. If 30 years of emergency medicine and the accumulated trauma of all those shifts had finally caught up with me. If the caller was real at all or just a manifestation of my own deteriorating mental state. The line between external and internal threat became impossible to distinguish. The police found nothing. No evidence of stalking, no suspicious persons, no explanation for how someone could know such intimate details of my life. They started suggesting gently that perhaps I was experiencing stress-related paranoia, that maybe I should talk to someone professional. But how could I explain that the voice on the phone knew things before I knew them myself? I stopped going out unless absolutely necessary, covered all my windows with blackout curtains, disconnected my doorbell, started sleeping, when I could sleep at all with lights on and a knife under my pillow. My daughter called, worried because I wasn't returning her messages. But how could I talk to her? How could I explain what was happening when I didn't understand it myself? The last call came on a night in late March. 1:17 in the morning, his voice coming through the phone line with that same calm certainty. But this time he didn't describe my day or my thoughts. Instead, he started talking about my dead husband. Details from our marriage that no one knew. Private moments and conversations that had existed only between the two of us. He used my husband's phrases, his patterns of speech, even mentioned the cologne he used to wear. That same scent I'd been smelling in my house for weeks, dismissing it as my imagination. I tried to hang up but found I couldn't. My hand wouldn't move to press the button, and his voice kept going, kept talking. And I couldn't tell anymore if it was coming from the phone or from inside my own head. The boundaries between us had dissolved completely. He wasn't watching me from outside. He was me, or I was him, or we'd never been separate at all. The recording of that shift ends at 3:42 in the morning, mid-conversation. Just my side of it, because the system only records the volunteer's voice, not the caller's. On the tape, you can hear me talking to someone, responding to things you can't hear. My voice gets progressively more agitated, more confused, and then it just stops, cutting off in the middle of a sentence. They found the office empty the next morning. My coat was still on the back of the chair, my purse sitting on the desk, my car in the parking lot. But I was gone. The investigation turned up nothing useful. No signs of struggle, no indication of where I'd gone or why. My apartment was found exactly as I'd left it, with all those blackout curtains and extra locks that hadn't kept anything out. The hotline supervisor found my documentation of the calls, but when they pulled the phone records, there was something strange. The calls I'd logged at 1:17 in the morning, the ones I'd described in such detail, they weren't there. No incoming calls during those times. No record of anyone on the other end of the line. The last entry in my journal, found on my desk at home, was dated the night I disappeared. I'd written just one sentence over and over, filling 3 pages in increasingly erratic handwriting. The sentence was simple. I am the caller. I am the caller. I am the caller. My daughter came to Tennessee to search for me, filed missing person reports, hired a private investigator. But I was never found. The hotline supervisor says sometimes she still gets calls at 1:17 in the morning from a number that doesn't show up on caller ID. When she answers, there's just breathing on the other end, and occasionally, very faintly, she can hear a woman's voice describing things she shouldn't know. Details about the supervisor's life, her thoughts, her fears. She never stays on the line long. Says it reminds her too much of what happened to me. Makes her wonder if the same thing could happen to her. If the line between helper and helped, between observer and observed, between self and other, is as solid as we like to believe. The office where I worked my last shift has been sealed. They moved the hotline to a different location, brought in someone to cleanse the space, though no one will say officially what they think happened there. But the volunteers who work overnight shifts at the new location report similar experiences sometimes. Calls that don't appear in the records. Voices that know too much. The feeling of being watched from inside their own thoughts. My case file remains open, though the police stopped actively investigating years ago. Sometimes my daughter calls them, asking if there's any news, any leads. But what could they tell her? That her mother answered the phone one too many times. That she listened to the wrong voice. That she forgot where she ended and something else began. The only physical evidence of my existence in those final weeks is the recordings from the hotline and my journal entries. Both tell the same story of someone losing their grip on reality, of boundaries dissolving, of a self becoming porous and uncertain. But they can't answer the question that haunts everyone who knew me. Was the caller real, or was I talking to myself all along? And if I was talking to myself, where did I go when that conversation finally ended? My name is Anderson, and I'm 19 years old. I'm a sophomore at Appalachian State University, studying forestry, because I've always loved these mountains and wanted to work outdoors. I grew up in Watauga County, North Carolina, on land that's been in my family for 4 generations. Every Thanksgiving break, I come home and go hunting with my grandfather's old rifle, using the deer stand he built back in the 70s on the ridge above our property. It's tradition, something that connects me to my family history and to these woods that I know better than anywhere else on earth. Or at least, I thought I knew them. November 1998 taught me that there are things in these mountains older and stranger than anything I learned about in my forestry classes. I arrived home on Tuesday night, the week of Thanksgiving. My parents were happy to see me, asked about school and grades and whether I was eating enough in the dorms. We had the same conversations we always had, comfortable and familiar. I told them I'd be heading out to the deer stand before dawn on Wednesday, and my mother packed me a thermos of coffee and some sandwiches like she'd been doing since I was old enough to hunt alone. Everything felt normal, felt right, felt like coming home always felt. I woke up at 4:30 Wednesday morning, dressed in layers against the November cold, and loaded my grandfather's rifle. The walk to the deer stand took about 40 minutes through woods I could navigate blindfolded. I'd been walking this same path since I was 7 years old, first with my grandfather, then with my father, and finally alone once they decided I was responsible enough. The trees were bare, their branches making dark patterns against the pre-dawn sky. Frost crunched under my boots, and my breath made clouds in the cold air. It was perfect hunting weather. The deer stand sat about 15 feet up in an old oak tree with a good view of the valley below, where deer like to move in the early morning. I climbed up the wooden ladder my grandfather had nailed into the trunk, settled into the small platform, and waited for the sun to rise. This was my favorite part of hunting, really. Not the killing, but the waiting. The absolute silence of the woods before dawn. The way the world slowly comes alive as light returns. I sipped my coffee and watched the darkness gradually fade into gray. That's when I noticed the carvings. They were on the trees surrounding the deer stand, marks I'd never seen before, even though I'd been coming to this spot for 12 years. They weren't random scratches or the kind of graffiti teenagers might carve. These were deliberate, precise symbols cut deep into the bark, circles within circles, lines that intersected at specific angles, patterns that seemed to repeat with variations. They looked old, the wood around them darkened with age, but I couldn't understand how I'd never noticed them before. I climbed down from the stand to examine them more closely. There were dozens of the symbols carved into at least 20 different trees in a rough circle around the deer stand. Some were at eye level, others higher up or lower down, but they all shared similar geometric patterns. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, thinking maybe one of my professors might know what they were. Some kind of historical marking system maybe, or surveyor's symbols from when this land was first parceled out. The sun was just starting to break over the eastern ridge when I climbed back up into the stand. The valley below was becoming visible, the morning mist rising from the hollow. That's when I saw them. At first I thought they were deer, a whole herd of them moving through the valley in the half-light. But as they got closer and the light got better, I realized they weren't deer at all, they were people. Maybe 15 or 20 of them, walking in a line through the valley. But they were wearing something on their heads, something that caught the early light and looked pale and wrong. I raised my grandfather's old binoculars and felt my stomach turn over. They were deer skulls, complete skulls with antlers still attached, worn like masks over human heads. The people wearing them were dressed in dark clothing that might have been robes or might have been regular clothes. It was hard to tell from this distance. But the way they moved was what really got to me. They walked in perfect synchronization, every step taken at exactly the same moment, turning their heads in unison like they were all controlled by the same mind. They were moving toward a clearing in the center of the valley, a place where nothing ever grew. I'd always wondered about that bare patch of earth, why trees and grass avoided it. But my grandfather had said it was probably just bad soil or a rock shelf too close to the surface. Now I watched as these people in their deer skull masks arranged themselves in a circle around the clearing. They stood perfectly still for a long moment, and then they began to move. It was a dance, I guess, though that word doesn't quite capture what I was seeing. They moved in patterns that seemed ritualistic, spinning and stepping and raising their arms in gestures that looked like they meant something specific. And they were chanting. I couldn't hear the words from this distance, but I could hear the sound of their voices rising and falling in rhythm. The sound made my skin crawl, made me want to cover my ears, even though it wasn't loud enough to really bother me. In the center of the circle, they built a fire. I don't know how they lit it so quickly, but suddenly there were flames rising from the bare ground, and the people in deer skulls were moving around it in increasingly complex patterns. The sun was fully up now, bright autumn light flooding the valley, and I could see everything clearly, too clearly. I wanted to look away, but couldn't. One of them broke from the circle and pulled something from a bag. It looked like herbs or plants, dried bundles that they threw into the fire. The smoke that rose up was thick and dark, darker than wood smoke should be, and it didn't dissipate the way normal smoke does. It hung in the air above them, forming shapes that almost looked intentional. And the smell reached me even up in my deer stand, carried on the morning breeze. It was sage and something medicinal, bitter and sharp, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I should call someone, the police maybe, or at least document what I was seeing. But when I looked at the screen, there was no signal. That wasn't unusual out here in the mountains, but the timing felt wrong. I raised my camera and started taking pictures through the telephoto lens, the shutter clicking quietly in the cold morning air. The ritual, or whatever it was, lasted maybe 30 minutes. Then, as abruptly as it had started, it ended. The people in deer skulls stood still around the fire for a moment, then began walking away in single file, disappearing into the woods on the far side of the valley. Within minutes, they were gone completely, and the valley was empty except for the dying fire. I stayed in the deer stand for another hour, waiting to make sure they weren't coming back. My hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. When I finally climbed down, I walked slowly toward the clearing, my rifle ready even though I didn't know what I'd do if I encountered any of them. The woods were completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the sound of my own footsteps on the frozen ground. The clearing was empty. The fire was out, and when I knelt to examine the ground where it had been, there was no evidence of burning. No char marks, no ash, no blackened earth. Just the same bare dirt that had always been there. I walked the perimeter of the clearing looking for footprints, for any sign that 20 people had been dancing here less than an hour ago. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed, covered in a thin layer of frost that showed no tracks at all. I searched the surrounding woods, following the direction they'd walked when they left. No broken branches, no trampled undergrowth, no sign that anyone had passed through. It was like they'd simply vanished. I checked my phone, pulled up the photos I'd taken. My stomach dropped. The photos showed the valley, showed the clearing, showed the morning light on the bare trees. But they didn't show any people. Just empty woods and an empty clearing. I scrolled through every image. Nothing. Just landscape shots that proved I'd been there but provided no evidence of what I'd witnessed. I hiked back to the house, my mind racing. I found my grandfather in his workshop behind the barn, and I told him everything I'd seen. He listened without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked me to show him on a map exactly where the clearing was. I pointed it out, and he nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd suspected. He told me the land had history I didn't know about. Back in the 30s, before he was born, there had been a religious sect living in these mountains. They weren't mainstream Christians or any recognized denomination. They practiced something older, something that mixed Christianity with traditions that went back further, to beliefs the first European settlers had brought with them, and mixed with things they'd learned from the Cherokee who'd lived here before them. The sect had been driven out eventually, accused of practicing witchcraft or devil worship or whatever term the local authorities had used. But my grandfather's father, my great-grandfather, had told stories about hearing drums in the mountains some nights, about finding circles of stones and carved symbols on trees. I asked him about the symbols I'd seen around the deer stand. He walked out to the ridge with me, and when he saw the carvings, his face went pale. He said they were boundary markers, warnings to stay away from sacred ground. He'd seen similar ones when he was young, before someone came through and tried to remove them all, but apparently they'd missed this spot, or maybe the symbols had been recarved. He told me the deer stand had been built in that specific tree because his father had told him it was a safe place, outside the marked territory, but close enough to watch over it. I asked him what they'd been doing down there, those people in deer skulls. He said he didn't know, and I believed him. But he said the sect had supposedly performed ceremonies at certain times of year, seasonal rituals tied to the old agricultural calendar. November, the time between harvest and the death of winter, had been important to them. He'd heard stories from old-timers when he was young about people seeing processions in the woods, about fires that left no trace, about chanting that seemed to come from the ground itself. We walked back to the house in silence. My grandmother was cooking Thanksgiving dinner, and the smell of turkey and stuffing filled the kitchen. Everything seemed so normal, so far removed from what I'd seen that morning. We ate dinner with my parents, and my younger sister said grace, talked about school and work and holiday plans. Nobody mentioned the valley, or the deer skulls, or the symbols carved into trees. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit up in bed. It was faint, barely audible, but definitely there. Drums. A rhythmic beating coming from somewhere out in the mountains. And underneath it, or maybe woven through it, the sound of voices chanting in unison. I got up and looked out my window. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to see the ridgeline and the dark mass of forest beyond. I couldn't see any fires, couldn't see any movement. But the sound continued, rising and falling like breath, like a heartbeat, like something ancient and patient that had been here long before my family cleared this land and would be here long after we were gone. The next morning, the sounds were gone. I hiked back up to the deer stand, and the clearing in the valley looked exactly as it always had. Empty and bare, refusing to support life, keeping its secrets. The symbols on the trees were still there, weathered and old and watching. I packed up my hunting gear and drove back to school a day early, telling my parents I had a paper due that I'd forgotten about. I graduated in 2002 and took a job with the Forestry Service in Virginia. I've never hunted on my family's land again. My grandfather died in 2005, taking whatever he really knew about that valley with him. Before he passed, he pulled me aside and told me some places aren't meant for us, that the mountains hold things older than our understanding, and the wise thing is to leave them alone. But I still wonder about what I saw that November morning. I've researched religious sects in Appalachia, looked for records of the group that was supposedly driven out in the 30s. I've found hints and fragments, references in old newspapers to disturbances and investigations, but nothing concrete. Nothing that explains the deer skulls, or the synchronized movement, or the fire that left no trace. And every November, when Thanksgiving approaches, I think about that valley. I wonder if they're still going there, whoever they are. Still performing whatever ritual they were performing. Still moving in patterns that look like dance, and feel like prayer, and mean something that exists outside the bounds of anything I was taught was real. My sister called me last year. She's living in the old family house now, raising her kids on the same land where we grew up. She mentioned, casually, that her oldest son had been asking about the deer stand, wanted to learn to hunt like his uncle used to. I told her maybe he should hunt somewhere else. Didn't explain why, just said that spot had never been very good for deer anyway, which is a lie. She didn't push it, but I could hear the question in her voice. I've thought about telling her what I saw, warning her properly. But what would I say? That I saw people in deer masks, performing a ritual that left no evidence. That our grandfather hinted at dark history without ever explaining it fully. That some mornings when the fog is heavy in the hollows, I can still smell sage and bitter herbs even though I'm 2 states away. The photos on my phone still show empty woods. The rational part of my mind suggests I imagined it all, that I fell asleep in the deer stand and dreamed something vivid enough to feel real. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that some questions don't have answers we're equipped to understand. Some traditions stretch back further than our records reach. And some places in these mountains belong to something that was here first and never really left. The deer stand is still there on that ridge, still overlooking that valley. The symbols are still carved into the trees, warning anyone who knows how to read them. And every November, if you're patient enough and quiet enough and willing to sit in the cold before dawn, you might see them too. The procession moving through the mist, the deer skulls pale in the early light, the fire that burns without leaving trace. Just don't expect your camera to capture it. Don't expect anyone to believe you. And don't expect answers to questions that these mountains have been keeping secret for longer than any of us have been asking. My name is Jimena, and I'm 25 years old. I moved to Morgantown, West Virginia 2 years ago to start my graduate program in environmental science at the university. It's a good school, affordable, and the Appalachian location was perfect for my research focus on mountain ecosystems. I found a small apartment on the edge of campus, a second-floor unit in an old house that had been converted into student housing. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and I loved the independence of living alone for the first time in my life. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly other students and a few longtime residents, the kind of place where you could walk home late at night without much concern. That sense of safety lasted exactly 18 months, until August 2022, when I learned that monsters don't always look like monsters, and the most terrifying predators are the ones who look just like everyone else. The summer semester had just ended, and campus was mostly empty. A lot of students had gone home for the break, leaving the area quieter than usual. I was staying to work on my thesis research, spending long days in the lab and longer nights writing up my findings. On that particular Thursday, I'd been at the university library until almost midnight, buried in journal articles and data analysis. My eyes were burning from staring at screens, and all I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and fall into bed. I got back to my apartment around 12:30 in the morning. The house was dark except for the porch light, which the landlord kept on all night. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor unit, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Everything felt normal. My laptop was still on the kitchen table where I'd left it that morning. My coffee cup sat in the sink. The pile of laundry I'd been meaning to fold was still on the couch. I locked the door behind me, something I always did without thinking, and headed to the bathroom to brush my teeth. I was in my bedroom, changing into pajamas when I heard it. A sound at my front door. Not knocking, but the distinctive rattle of someone trying the doorknob. My first thought was that one of my neighbors had the wrong apartment, maybe coming home drunk and confused about which door was theirs. I walked back to the living room and called out, asking who was there. No answer. Just the sound of the doorknob being tried again, more insistently this time. My heart started beating faster. I moved to the window and looked down at the porch, trying to see who was at my door. There was a man standing there, but the angle was wrong, and the porch light cast his face in shadow. I couldn't make out his features, just that he was wearing dark clothes and seemed focused entirely on my doorknob. I stepped back from the window and grabbed my phone, my hands shaking slightly as I unlocked it. I called campus police, which seemed safer than calling 911 for what might turn out to be nothing. I explained the situation in a whisper, gave them my address, and was told an officer would be there within 5 minutes. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me, and I heard her radio the call. 5 minutes. I just needed to stay calm for 5 minutes. The sound at my door stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe he'd left. Maybe he'd realized this was a mistake and had gone away. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. The sound of breaking glass. It was coming from my kitchen, from the window that faced the back of the house, the one that looked out over the alley where we kept the garbage bins. He was breaking in. This wasn't a confused neighbor or a case of mistaken identity. Someone was actively breaking into my apartment, and I was alone with a locked door between us that was about to stop mattering. The dispatcher was asking me questions, telling me to stay on the line, saying officers were 2 minutes away. But 2 minutes suddenly felt like an eternity. I ran to my bedroom and dove into the closet, pulling the door shut behind me and wedging myself into the back corner behind my hanging clothes. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the dispatcher's voice, telling me to stay quiet, stay hidden. Help was almost there, but I could hear him in my apartment now. Footsteps moving through my kitchen, glass crunching under his shoes. He wasn't trying to be quiet. That was somehow worse than if he'd been sneaking. The casual confidence of those footsteps said he didn't care if I heard him, didn't care if I knew he was there. I heard him moving through my living room, heard him pause, heard something fall over. He was searching, methodically checking each space. I tried to control my breathing, tried to stay absolutely silent, but my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. The closet was small and dark, and I could smell my own fear, that sharp, acidic smell of terror sweat that's different from any other kind. His footsteps came closer. He was in my bedroom now. I could hear him opening drawers, could hear the rustle of him going through my things. The closet door was maybe 8 feet from where he was standing. I pressed myself further back into the corner, made myself as small as possible behind the hanging clothes, and prayed he wouldn't look here. Wouldn't think to check. The closet door opened. Light flooded in from the bedroom, and through the gap between my hanging shirts I could see him. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with an ordinary face that I'd pass on the street without a second glance. He was wearing jeans and a dark hoodie, and he stood there, looking into my closet with an expression of mild curiosity, like he was shopping and considering his options. He reached in and started pushing clothes aside, moving slowly down the rod. Each second lasted forever. I could see his hand, could see the tattoo on his wrist, could see the dirt under his fingernails. He was 3 hangers away from where I was hiding. Then 2. Then 1. His hand touched the shirt directly in front of my face, and I knew in that moment that this was it, that he was about to see me, and I had no idea what would happen when he did. That's when I heard the sirens. They were close, maybe a block away, and getting closer. His hand stopped moving. He stood frozen for a moment, listening, and I could see his face change as he calculated his options. The sirens were right outside now, and I heard car doors slamming, heard voices shouting. He yanked his hand back from the closet, turned and ran. I heard him sprint through my apartment, heard him go out the way he'd come in, through the broken kitchen window. I heard more voices, heard someone yelling, "Stop! Police!" And then I heard running footsteps in the alley behind the house. I stayed in the closet, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The dispatcher was still on the phone, telling me the officers were inside the building, telling me it was safe to come out. But I couldn't make my body respond to that information. An officer found me about 2 minutes later. She opened the closet door slowly, announced herself clearly, and when she saw me crammed into the back corner, her expression softened. She told me he was gone, told me other officers were pursuing him, told me I was safe now. She helped me stand up on legs that didn't want to support me and led me out of the closet, out of my bedroom, out of the apartment that no longer felt like mine. They caught him 3 blocks away. He tried to run but wasn't fast enough, and 2 officers tackled him in someone's front yard. His name was published in the news later, but I don't like to say it or think it. He was 32 years old, had a record of breaking and entering, and this wasn't his first time doing this. That's what the detective told me the next day when I gave my statement. This man had been targeting women who lived alone near the university, had been watching them, learning their routines, waiting until they were home alone late at night. The detective showed me surveillance footage from a gas station 2 blocks from my apartment. The footage was from 3 weeks earlier, and it showed me paying for coffee. And in the background, clearly visible, was him, just standing there, watching me. The detective said they found other photos on his phone, pictures of me leaving my apartment, walking to campus, sitting in the library. He'd been watching me for weeks, maybe longer, learning everything about my schedule and habits. They found a notebook in his car. I didn't see it myself, but the detective told me about it later, during the trial. He'd been keeping records, addresses of women who lived alone, their schedules, notes about when they left their houses, when they came home, whether they had roommates or boyfriends. My address was in there, along with 11 others. The police contacted all of them, warned them, offered increased patrols. 2 of the women said they'd noticed things, signs that someone had been near their homes, but they dismissed it as paranoia. The trial was 8 months later. I had to testify, had to sit in that courtroom and describe the night he broke into my home, the minutes I spent in the closet listening to him search for me. His lawyer tried to argue that he'd panicked, that he'd been looking for a place to hide after committing some other crime, that he hadn't intended to hurt anyone. But the evidence was overwhelming. The photos, the notebook, the other women who came forward with similar stories of feeling watched, of finding signs that someone had been near their homes. He was convicted on multiple counts: breaking and entering, stalking, attempted assault. The judge gave him 12 years, and I sat in the courtroom and felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not closure. Just exhaustion and the knowledge that 12 years eventually ends, and then he'll be out there again. I moved out of that apartment the week after the break-in. Couldn't stay there, couldn't sleep in that bedroom, knowing he'd been in it, searching through my things, looking for me. I found a new place on the other side of town, a building with a doorman and security cameras and other people around all the time. My new apartment is on the 6th floor, too high for anyone to climb to the windows. I have 3 locks on my door and a security system that's connected to my phone. But none of that really helps. The fear isn't about the specific apartment or the specific locks. It's deeper than that, more fundamental. It's the knowledge that I wasn't safe when I thought I was safe, that someone could watch me for weeks without me knowing, that he chose me, specifically me, out of all the possible targets, and I'll never really know why. What was it about me that made him decide I was the one worth following, worth watching, worth breaking into? I finished my graduate program, but didn't stay in Morgantown. Took a job in Colorado, as far from West Virginia as I could get while staying in the mountains I'd come to study. I told people it was for career opportunities, better research facilities. But really, I just needed to be somewhere he'd never been. Somewhere that didn't have memories of that night embedded in every street corner. I'm in therapy now, have been since it happened. My therapist says what I experienced was trauma, that my brain is trying to process a situation where I was genuinely in mortal danger, where the only thing that saved me was luck and timing. She says the hypervigilance is normal, the way I check and recheck locks, the way I can't relax in my own home, the way I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night convinced I heard something. She says it will get better with time. But it's been over 2 years, and I still can't be alone at night without feeling him there. Still can't hear an unexpected sound without my heart rate spiking. Still can't see a man in a dark hoodie without wanting to run. The rational part of my brain knows he's in prison, knows he can't hurt me, knows I'm safe. But the other part, the part that spent those minutes in the closet listening to him search for me, that part doesn't believe in safety anymore. My friends tell me I should be grateful, that it could have been so much worse, that he didn't actually hurt me, that the police came in time, that he's locked up now, and they're right. I know they're right. It could have been worse. It was worse for other women, women whose names I read in the case files, women who weren't as lucky as I was. But knowing it could have been worse doesn't make it feel better. Doesn't give me back the sense of security I used to have. I used to love living alone. Loved the independence, the freedom, the quiet. Now I have a roommate, Callie, another graduate student who needed a place and didn't mind my excessive security measures. She's patient with my habits, doesn't comment when I check the locks 3 times before bed, or when I insist on leaving lights on all night. She's a good roommate, but more than that, she's a presence. Another person in the apartment. Someone who would hear if something was wrong. The worst part is how it changed the way I see the world. I used to think most people were basically good, that bad things happened, but they were rare, that if you were careful and smart, you'd probably be fine. Now I know different. Now I know that predators look like everyone else, that they can be patient, methodical, willing to watch and wait for the perfect opportunity, that they choose their victims carefully and study them like projects. That being careful and smart sometimes isn't enough. I think about the other women in his notebook sometimes, the ones whose addresses were listed, whose schedules he'd been learning. I wonder if they feel the way I do now, if they check their locks compulsively, if they can't relax in their own homes, if they see potential danger in every ordinary moment. I wonder if knowing they were on his list but weren't chosen makes it better or worse, if being bypassed is a relief or just another kind of violation, knowing you were considered, evaluated, and filed away for later. The detective told me that statistically, I did everything right. I locked my door. I called for help immediately. I found a safe place to hide. My actions probably saved my life, but I can't help thinking about all the things I did wrong in the weeks leading up to that night. All the times I walked home alone late at night. All the times I didn't notice him watching me. All the ways I was careless with my safety because I felt secure in a neighborhood that seemed safe. That's what he stole from me, really. Not my belongings, not my physical safety in that immediate moment, but my ability to feel secure. My ability to trust my own judgment about when I'm safe. He proved that my instincts were wrong, that I couldn't protect myself through awareness alone, that danger could be watching me for weeks while I went about my life completely oblivious. I still live in the mountains, still study ecosystems and wildlife and the complex relationships that make these environments function. But I understand now what I didn't understand before. That predator and prey relationships aren't just academic concepts or ecological principles. They're lived experiences, and sometimes you don't know your prey until the moment the predator shows himself. He's eligible for parole in 8 years. I'll be 33 years old. I've already written a letter to the parole board to be read when the time comes, explaining what that night did to me, asking them to keep him incarcerated for the full sentence. I don't know if it will matter. The system works the way it works, and sometimes people get out early for good behavior, for overcrowding, for reasons that have nothing to do with whether they're actually safe to release. But I'll be ready. I'll know when he's out. I'll make sure I'm somewhere he can't find me, somewhere he couldn't get to even if he wanted to. And I'll keep living my life, keep checking my locks, keep sleeping with the lights on, keep looking over my shoulder. Because that's what survival looks like now, not dramatic or heroic, just cautious and vigilant and tired. That's what I learned that August night in Morgantown. That safety is an illusion. That home is just a place with locks that can be broken. And that the person who seems most ordinary might be the one who's been watching you all along, waiting for their chance, planning what they'll do when they finally get you alone. My name is Kyler, and I'm 30 years old. I work as a community radio DJ at a small AM station in Bluefield, West Virginia, right on the border between West Virginia and Mercer County. It's not glamorous work, and the pay is terrible, but I love it. There's something magical about radio, about sending your voice out into the darkness and knowing that somewhere people are listening. Our station, WBLF, has been broadcasting since 1947, serving the surrounding counties with local news, music, and whatever else the community needs. I've been doing the overnight shift for 3 years now, 11 at night until 6 in the morning, keeping the lonely company while the rest of the world sleeps. I thought I knew everything about our station, about our equipment, about the electromagnetic spectrum, and how radio waves work. Then January 2018 happened, and I learned that sometimes signals come from places that shouldn't exist, carrying messages from times that should be long gone. The overnight shift is usually quiet. I play a mix of classic country and oldies, take the occasional call from insomniacs and truck drivers, read the weather forecast every hour. Our studio is in an old building downtown surrounded by empty storefronts and closed offices. When I'm there at night, I'm often the only person in a 3-block radius. The isolation doesn't bother me. If anything, I prefer it. There's a kind of peace in being alone with the equipment, watching the VU meters bounce with the music, adjusting levels, and queuing up the next song. It started on a Tuesday night in mid-January, one of those bitter cold nights where the temperature drops below zero and the wind cuts through every layer you're wearing. I was about 2 hours into my shift, had just finished playing a Johnny Cash set, and was queuing up the next block of music when I heard it. A voice bleeding through my headphones, faint but distinct, speaking underneath the song I was monitoring. At first I thought it was interference from another station, maybe something atmospheric allowing a distant signal to propagate further than usual. But the voice wasn't speaking in a contemporary style. The cadence, the pronunciation, even the background sound quality felt wrong, felt old. I adjusted the receiver, thinking maybe I was picking up some harmonic or frequency bleed. But when I isolated it, when I really focused on what I was hearing, my skin started to crawl. It was a commercial, an advertisement for a car dealership in Bluefield, enthusiastically describing deals on 1974 models, urging listeners to come down and see their selection. The enthusiasm in the announcer's voice was genuine, authentic to that era, not some retro recreation. And then, even more unsettling, the commercial ended and another began. This one was for a grocery store that I knew had closed in 1982, offering specials on products with prices that hadn't been current in decades. I pulled off my headphones and listened to the studio itself. The advertisements were coming through my board, through equipment that was receiving something it shouldn't be able to receive. I checked my transmitter settings, verified we were broadcasting on our assigned frequency, confirmed all our equipment was functioning normally. Everything looked fine on my end. But that phantom signal was still there, bleeding through like a ghost in the machine. I decided to trace it. Our station has old records, logs of every broadcast going back to the beginning. I went into the archive room, a dusty space filled with filing cabinets and old reel-to-reel tapes, and started pulling records from 1974. It took me about 30 minutes to find it, but there it was. The exact same commercial aired on WBLF on January 15, 1974, at 1:37 in the morning. The same car dealership, the same prices, the same announcer's voice. I was hearing a broadcast from 44 years ago, somehow bleeding through into the present. I went back to the studio and started monitoring more carefully, recording everything I heard. Over the next hour, I documented dozens of these phantom transmissions. Commercials, news updates, weather forecasts, all from different dates in the 70s and early 80s. They were faint, always underneath whatever I was currently broadcasting, but they were definitely there. And they were all transmissions that had originally aired on WBLF decades ago. The next night, I came in early, before my shift started, and started checking our equipment more thoroughly. Our station manager, a guy named Baylor, who'd been with WBLF since the 90s, came by around 10:30 to drop off some paperwork. I played him the recordings I'd made, explained what I'd been hearing. His face went pale, and he told me something I hadn't known. Our current studio wasn't the original broadcast location. WBLF had operated from a different building until 1985, when they'd moved to our current downtown location. The old transmitter site was about 5 miles outside of town, up on a ridge that gave good coverage of the valleys. But that site had been abandoned for years, replaced by newer equipment at a different location. Baylor pulled up the address of the old transmitter site on his phone and suggested we drive out there. It was already dark, already cold, but curiosity and a growing sense of unease made the decision easy. We took his truck and drove out of town, following roads that got progressively more narrow and poorly maintained. The transmitter site was at the end of a rutted dirt road, a small concrete building surrounded by chain-link fence. The fence was rusted and sagging, and the gate stood open, hanging from one hinge. We approached the building slowly, and I could feel something immediately, a sensation like standing too close to high-voltage lines, that prickling awareness of electromagnetic fields that you feel more than hear. The door to the building was unlocked, and when we pushed it open, we saw equipment. Old broadcasting equipment, dusty and covered in cobwebs, but somehow still running. Lights were on. Dials were showing active signals. VU meters were bouncing, indicating audio was being processed. But there was no power. The building had been disconnected from the electrical grid in 1985. I checked the breaker box, and it was dead. No electricity coming in, yet the equipment was running, powered by nothing I could identify. Baylor started examining the transmitter, and his hands were shaking. He recognized the setup, said it was identical to how the station had been configured in the late 70s, and on the broadcast console, frozen in time, was a schedule sheet dated January 1979. With programming notes in handwriting he said belonged to a DJ who died in 1981. We stood there in that impossible room, watching equipment that shouldn't be operational process signals that shouldn't exist, and I felt reality becoming negotiable. The transmitter was broadcasting. We could see it on the meters, could hear it if we connected headphones to the monitor output. It was playing a loop of old WBLF broadcasts, advertisements and music and news from decades ago, cycling through them in no particular order. A time capsule of radio history, somehow still transmitting into the electromagnetic spectrum, bleeding through into our current broadcasts. I asked Baylor if we should shut it down. He looked at the equipment for a long time before answering. He said he didn't know how. The power source was unknown. The mechanism keeping it operational was beyond our understanding. And honestly, part of him didn't want to shut it down. These were broadcasts from the station's history, voices of people who'd sat in this same building doing the same job we did now. There was something profound about that continuity, even if the mechanism was impossible. We left the building without touching anything and drove back to town in silence. I finished my shift that night, listening to those phantom broadcasts weave through my programming, voices from the past speaking to the present, through channels that shouldn't connect them. Over the next few weeks, I researched everything I could about radio propagation, about atmospheric conditions that might allow old signals to somehow persist or be reflected back to Earth. But nothing I found explained what we'd discovered. Radio waves travel at the speed of light. They don't loop. They don't store themselves in abandoned buildings and replay decades later. I also researched the history of the old transmitter site. It had been built in 1947 when the station first went on the air. For 38 years, every broadcast WBLF made went through that building, through that equipment. Thousands of hours of programming, millions of words spoken into microphones, all converted to electromagnetic waves and sent out into the world. Maybe, I thought, some of it never left. Maybe the building itself had become saturated with those signals, holding onto them the way magnetic tape holds recordings, playing them back through equipment that refused to stay dead. But that theory, as comforting as it was, didn't explain the power source, didn't explain how equipment with no electricity could continue to function, didn't explain the way the broadcasts seemed to respond to our current programming, bleeding through at specific times, as if they were aware of what we were doing and trying to communicate across the years. I went back to the site alone a week later. It was daytime, and I thought maybe in the light things would make more sense, would seem less impossible. But the building looked even more abandoned in daylight, even more wrong. The equipment was still running, still processing signals, still broadcasting into the void. I sat in that dusty room and listened, through old headphones, to broadcasts from before I was born, hearing voices of people who died long ago speaking with the immediacy of the present. One broadcast caught my attention. A news report from March 1983, describing a house fire in Bluefield that had killed a family of 4. The reporter's voice was somber, professional, delivering the facts with appropriate gravity. But then, underneath his voice, I heard something else, screaming, faint but unmistakable, screaming that hadn't been in the original broadcast, that seemed to be bleeding through from somewhere else. From the fire itself, maybe. From the moment of the tragedy, somehow imprinted on the electromagnetic spectrum and playing back 45 years later. I pulled off the headphones, my hands shaking. This wasn't just old broadcasts playing on a loop. This was something else, something that suggested the radio waves weren't just carrying information but somehow preserving moments, storing experiences, keeping pieces of the past alive in ways we didn't understand. I reported everything to Baylor. He came out to the site, verified what I'd found, and we made a decision. We documented everything, took photographs, recorded audio, made detailed notes. Then we contacted the station owner, a corporation that held licenses for several small market stations across Appalachia. We expected them to be skeptical, to dismiss our findings as equipment malfunction or atmospheric anomaly. Instead, they were disturbingly unsurprised. They sent a technician, a woman named Catherine, who'd worked for the company for 20 years. She examined the equipment, took readings with instruments I didn't recognize, and confirmed what we'd found. Then she told us this wasn't unique to WBLF. Other stations in the network had similar phenomena, old transmitter sites that continued to operate despite having no power, broadcasts from decades past bleeding through into current programming, signals that seemed to exist outside normal physics, that defied conventional understanding of how radio worked. She said the company policy was to leave the sites alone. They'd tried shutting them down, tried dismantling the equipment, but it never worked. The broadcasts continued, or new ones started, or stranger things happened. It was better, she said, to just let them be, to monitor them, to document them, but not to interfere. Some things, she suggested, were beyond our ability to control or understand. Some signals, once sent, never really stopped traveling. We sealed the building, put a better lock on the fence, and posted signs warning against trespassing. The phantom broadcasts continued, weaving through WBLF's programming like threads from the past stitching through the present. Most listeners probably never noticed them, never heard those faint voices underneath the music, but they were there, persistent and patient, carrying messages from a time when the station was new and the world was different. I kept working the overnight shift, but my relationship with the equipment changed. I started thinking of the station not just as a job or a technical process, but as something living, something with memory. Every word I spoke into the microphone, every song I played, every announcement I made, all of it was being converted to electromagnetic waves and sent out into the world. And maybe, somewhere, somehow, it was being stored, preserved in ways we couldn't detect or measure, waiting to bleed through decades or centuries from now when someone else sat in a studio and wondered about the voices they heard underneath their own. 3 months after we discovered the old transmitter site, something new happened. I was doing my show, playing late-night jazz, when I heard my own voice bleeding through the phantom broadcasts. But it wasn't from earlier that night. It was from 5 years in the future, according to the date I heard myself announce. Future me was playing different music, mentioning events that hadn't happened yet, speaking with a weariness I didn't currently feel, but somehow recognized as authentic. I recorded it, documented it, but I didn't tell anyone. Some things are too strange to share, too impossible to explain. I kept the recording in a safe place, and sometimes I listened to it, hearing my future self speak about a world I haven't experienced yet, wondering if that future is fixed or if knowing about it changes anything. The old transmitter site is still there, still operating, still broadcasting loops of WBLF's history into the electromagnetic spectrum, and now, apparently, it's broadcasting the future too. Time, it seems, is less linear in the world of radio waves than we assume. Past and future bleed into the present, all of it coexisting in the same spectrum, separated only by frequency and our limited ability to perceive what's actually there. I still work the overnight shift at WBLF, still play music for insomniacs and truck drivers, still read the weather forecast every hour. But I listen differently now, attentive to the spaces between the signals, to the voices that speak from times that aren't quite now. And I wonder, when I speak into the microphone, who's listening? Not just in the present, but in the past and future, in all the times and places where my voice will eventually bleed through. A phantom transmission from a man sitting alone in a studio in Bluefield, West Virginia, speaking into the darkness and hoping someone, somewhere, sometime, is hearing what he has to say. The electromagnetic spectrum is vast, far larger than the thin slice we use for communication. And maybe, just maybe, all of it is occupied. All of it is carrying signals from every time and place, from everyone who ever spoke into a microphone or transmitted a thought into the void. We just don't have the equipment to hear it all, don't have the perception to recognize voices from times we haven't lived yet or times we've forgotten. But sometimes, on cold January nights when atmospheric conditions are right and the world is quiet and you're alone in a radio studio at 3 in the morning, you hear them, the voices from elsewhere and elsewhen speaking through static and time, reminding you that nothing truly ends. Every broadcast continues forever, traveling outward at the speed of light, reaching into infinity. And sometimes, impossibly, it comes back, echoing through abandoned buildings and obsolete equipment, proving that the past isn't really past and the future isn't really future, and radio waves connect more than just transmitters and receivers. They connect moments. They connect lives. They connect times that should be separate but somehow aren't, creating a web of electromagnetic memory that encompasses everything ever broadcast and everything that ever will be. And once you know that, once you've heard your own voice speaking from 5 years ahead, you can never listen to radio the same way again. My name is Onyx, and I'm 37 years old. I work as a physician's assistant at a rural health clinic in Hazard, Kentucky, right in the heart of Perry County. I've been doing this work for 11 years now, ever since I finished my training and decided I wanted to practice medicine in underserved communities. The clinic serves a wide area, covering several hollows where people don't have easy access to health care. We see everything from routine checkups to emergencies that should really go to a hospital but don't, because the nearest one is over an hour away. I thought I'd seen every kind of medical condition these mountains could produce. Respiratory issues from the coal mines, diabetes, heart disease, the usual chronic conditions that plague rural Appalachia. Then May 2011 happened, and a patient walked into my clinic with something that shouldn't exist, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about biology and what's possible in the human body. It was a Thursday afternoon, unseasonably warm for May, and we'd been busy all day with the usual parade of patients. I was just finishing up paperwork on a diabetic patient when our receptionist, Rosalie, knocked on my office door and told me there was a walk-in who needed to be seen immediately. The urgency in her voice made me drop what I was doing and follow her to examination room 2. The patient was a man in his mid-50s, a coal miner I'd seen a few times before for routine things. His name was Ibrahim, and he'd always been healthy, the kind of patient who came in grudgingly and only when his wife insisted. But the man sitting on my examination table looked nothing like the robust miner I remembered. He'd lost weight, maybe 20 pounds, and his skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor. But what immediately caught my attention were his arms. Both forearms were covered in lesions, raised welts that formed patterns across his skin. I put on gloves and examined him carefully. The lesions were unlike anything I'd encountered in my medical training. They weren't infected, weren't inflamed in the typical way. Instead, they had a strange symmetry to them, forming almost geometric patterns that looked deliberate rather than random. And when I looked closely, really closely, I could see movement. Not the kind of movement you see with maggots in a wound or parasites under the skin. This was different. The lesions themselves seemed to pulse slightly, to shift and reconfigure as I watched. Ibrahim told me the lesions had appeared about 2 weeks ago, starting as small bumps that gradually grew and spread. They didn't hurt exactly, but they itched constantly, and he could feel something moving under his skin. He'd tried to ignore it, had used over-the-counter creams and ointments, but they kept getting worse. His wife had finally insisted he come see me, and looking at his arms, I was glad she had. I took a detailed history, asked him about exposure to chemicals, to animals, to anything unusual. He worked in a mine about 15 miles from Hazard, in a hollow called Troublesome Creek, Nothing out of the ordinary in his work, he said. Same mine he'd been working for 20 years. But then he mentioned something that made my instincts perk up. Several other miners from his crew had developed similar symptoms. Not everyone, just 4 or 5 guys who all worked in the same section of the mine, all living in the same hollow. I called our clinic physician, a doctor, who'd been practicing in Perry County for 30 years. He came and examined Ibrahim, and I saw concern flash across his face. He'd never seen anything like this either. We took samples, scraped some tissue from the lesions, drew blood, took photographs. Ibrahim was patient through all of it, though I could see he was scared. He kept asking if it was cancer, if it was contagious, if his wife and kids were safe. We told him we'd need to run tests, that we'd call him as soon as we had results. He left with prescriptions for antibiotics and antihistamines, though neither of us really thought they'd help. After he was gone, I looked at the tissue samples under our microscope, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The tissue contained organisms, microscopic things that moved with coordinated purpose, that seemed to be working together to form the patterns we'd seen on his skin. They didn't look like any parasite I'd studied. They looked almost crystalline in structure, with geometries that seemed too perfect to be biological. Over the next 3 days, 4 more patients came in with identical symptoms. All miners from the same crew, all living within a 5-mile radius in Troublesome Creek Hollow. All with the same geometric lesions, the same sense of movement under their skin, the same terror in their eyes. I documented everything, sent samples to the state health department, and started making calls to specialists. The state health department responded faster than I expected. Within a week, we had epidemiologists on site, taking samples, interviewing patients, mapping out the geographic distribution of cases. They were thorough and professional, but I could see the confusion on their faces. Whatever this was, it didn't fit any known disease pattern. The organisms in the tissue samples defied classification. They weren't bacteria, weren't viruses, weren't any known parasite. The lab reports kept coming back with the same conclusion. Unknown origin, unknown species, unknown mechanism of infection. Then the CDC got involved. I'd never dealt with federal health officials before, and their presence made everything feel more serious, more urgent. They set up a mobile lab in Hazard, brought in equipment I'd never seen, started running tests that went far beyond normal medical diagnostics. They quarantined the hollow, restricted access to the mine, interviewed everyone who'd had contact with the infected patients. The whole operation felt like something from a movie, except this was real, and my patients were the ones suffering. The lesions continued to spread on all 5 patients. The patterns became more complex, more intricate, covering their arms and starting to appear on their torsos. But strangely, none of them were getting sicker in traditional ways. No fever, no systemic infection, no organ damage. It was like the organisms were living in their skin without actually harming them, like just changing them, transforming their tissue into something else. I spent hours talking with the CDC researchers, trying to understand what we were dealing with. One of them, a microbiologist who specialized in emerging diseases, told me something that kept me awake at night. She said the organisms appeared to be responding to each other, communicating across the bodies of different patients. The patterns on one patient's arm would begin to mirror patterns appearing on another patient's arm, despite the patients having no contact with each other after diagnosis. It suggested some kind of collective intelligence, some kind of coordination that shouldn't be possible for organisms with no nervous system. 10 days after the first patient came to my clinic, something changed. The organisms started dying, all of them, simultaneously, across all 5 patients. Within 48 hours, the lesions began to heal. The geometric patterns faded, the sense of movement stopped, and the tissue samples showed dead organisms breaking down and being absorbed by the body. It was like whatever had infected them had simply decided to stop, to die, to disappear as mysteriously as it had appeared. The CDC ran more tests. They examined the dead organisms, tried to figure out what had killed them, but they couldn't find a cause. No immune response from the patients, no environmental change, no treatment we'd administered. The organisms had just died, all at once, for no reason anyone could determine. Within a month, all 5 patients were completely healed. Their skin showed no trace of the lesions, no scarring, nothing to indicate they'd ever been infected. The CDC packed up their mobile lab and left. They took all the samples, all the data, all the documentation we'd compiled. Before they left, one of the researchers pulled me aside and gave me a number to call if we ever saw similar cases again. She also told me very carefully that this incident would be classified. Not secret exactly, but not public either. The official record would show an outbreak of an unidentified dermatological condition that resolved spontaneously. No mention of the strange organisms, no mention of the coordinated patterns, no mention of anything that might raise uncomfortable questions. I asked her what she really thought it was. She looked at me for a long time before answering, and when she did, her voice was quiet, uncertain. She said she thought we'd encountered something that existed in that mine, in that hollow, in the environment of Troublesome Creek, something that had always been there but usually stayed dormant, stayed hidden. The mining activity had disturbed it somehow, brought it into contact with humans, allowed it to infect and colonize living tissue. But it wasn't adapted to human hosts, wasn't able to survive long-term in our bodies, so it had died out naturally. But then she said something that haunted me. She said this wasn't the first time. The CDC had records of similar outbreaks, all in Appalachia, all in mining communities, going back decades, always the same pattern. Miners developing strange lesions with geometric patterns, organisms that couldn't be classified, spontaneous resolution after a few weeks. The cases were rare, separated by years, but they kept happening. And every time the CDC would investigate, document, and classify it, and nothing would change. I asked her why they didn't warn people, why they didn't restrict mining in areas where this had happened before. She gave me a sad smile and said it wasn't that simple. The outbreaks were too rare to justify shutting down mines that entire communities depended on for employment. The organisms always died out on their own, never caused permanent harm. And honestly, they didn't understand it well enough to know what they'd even be warning people about. How do you tell someone to be careful of something you can't identify, can't explain, and can't predict? After the CDC left, I tried to go back to normal practice, but I couldn't stop thinking about those organisms, about the patterns they'd formed, about the way they'd seemed to communicate across different bodies. I started researching, spending my evenings reading journal articles about emerging diseases, about environmental pathogens, about the intersection of mining and public health, and I found hints, scattered references in old medical literature to similar cases going back over a century. There was a case in 1952 in the same area of Kentucky. Miners developing skin lesions with unusual patterns, spontaneous resolution after 3 weeks. Another case in 1983, different mine but similar hollow, identical symptoms and timeline. The reports were brief, vague, always inconclusive, but the pattern was there if you knew to look for it. Something in these mountains, something old and strange that occasionally came into contact with humans and produced these unexplained infections. I talked to Rosalie about it one day, showed her the research I'd compiled. She listened quietly, then told me her grandmother had stories about these hollows, about places in the mountains where strange things grew, where the earth itself was different. The old-timers called them thin places, spots where the boundary between our world and something else was permeable. Most people dismissed it as superstition, as the kind of folklore that rural communities generate to explain things they don't understand. But her grandmother had believed it, had told Rosalie that some places in these mountains weren't meant for human habitation, that the deeper you dug, the more likely you were to find things that should stay buried. I don't know if I believe in thin places or supernatural boundaries. I'm a medical professional, trained in science and evidence-based practice, but I know what I saw in those tissue samples. I know those organisms existed, that they behaved in ways that defied biological classification, that they formed patterns too complex and coordinated to be random. And I know they came from somewhere in that hollow, from depths in the earth where mining equipment had broken through into spaces that hadn't seen light in millions of years. The mine where Ibrahim and the others worked is still operational. The hollow is still inhabited. Life went back to normal after the outbreak ended, or at least appeared to. But I've kept in touch with those 5 patients, check in with them every few months. They're all healthy, showing no lasting effects from their infection, but they all report the same thing. Sometimes, late at night, they can feel something under their skin. Not movement exactly, more like a memory of movement, like their bodies remember being colonized, remember hosting something that changed them at a cellular level, and that memory persists even though the organisms are long dead. I filed my own report, separate from the CDC documentation, detailed everything I'd observed, every test result, every strange finding. I keep it in a locked file in my office, along with photographs and tissue samples I kept back before the CDC took everything. I don't know what I'll ever do with it, who I'd even show it to, but it feels important to have a record, to have proof that this happened, that it was real. Sometimes I drive out to Troublesome Creek Hollow, park on the ridge above the mine, and just watch. The mine operates around the clock, machinery constantly digging deeper, extracting coal from seams that run through the mountain like veins. And I wonder what else is down there. What other organisms or entities or things that don't fit our categories exist in those depths, waiting for the next time human activity brings them into contact with the surface world. The CDC researcher's number is in my phone. I haven't had to call it yet. There haven't been any new cases, no repeat outbreaks, no sign that whatever infected those miners is still active. But I keep the number handy, check it periodically to make sure it's still valid, because I know it will happen again. Maybe not here, maybe not in my clinic, but somewhere in these mountains, someone will dig too deep or disturb the wrong place, and those organisms will find new hosts. And when that happens, the CDC will come with their mobile labs and their classifications and their careful language, and they'll document it and contain it and then leave, and nothing will change. That's what I've learned from this experience, that there are things in these mountains we don't understand, things that exist alongside us in spaces we can't fully perceive or control, that modern medicine and scientific understanding have limits, boundaries beyond which we're just making educated guesses, and that sometimes the old stories, the folklore, and superstitions that educated people dismiss contain more truth than we're comfortable admitting. I still love my work, still find fulfillment in serving this community, in providing healthcare to people who need it, but I practice with a new awareness now, an understanding that the human body is more permeable than I was taught, that it can host things science hasn't cataloged, that infection and colonization can take forms we're not prepared to recognize. And I know that somewhere in the CDC archives, in classified files and restricted databases, there are records of cases like mine stretching back over a century. Different doctors, different patients, different hollows, but always the same pattern. Always in Appalachia, always connected to mining, always resolving spontaneously, always leaving more questions than answers. A legacy of encounters between human bodies and something that exists in the depths of these ancient mountains. Something that occasionally surfaces and reminds us that for all our medical knowledge and technological capability, there are still mysteries we can't solve, organisms we can't classify, and depths we shouldn't disturb. My name is Caesar, and I'm 45 years old. I've been working as a construction foreman for 22 years, building everything from shopping centers to office complexes across the Southeast. It's honest work, hard work, and I've always taken pride in seeing projects through from breaking ground to ribbon cutting. I've worked on dozens of sites, managed hundreds of workers, dealt with every kind of construction challenge you can imagine. But nothing in my 2 decades of experience prepared me for what happened in October 2020, when my crew started building luxury condos in Asheville, North Carolina, and we discovered that some land remembers what happened on it, and some dead don't rest easy when you disturb their graves. The development was supposed to be straightforward. A local investment group had purchased 15 acres in Buncombe County, just outside Asheville proper, with plans to build high-end condominiums targeting retirees and wealthy professionals moving to the area. The location was beautiful, situated on a hillside with views of the Blue Ridge Mountains, close enough to downtown for convenience, but far enough out to feel peaceful. The land had been vacant for years, covered in old-growth trees and thick underbrush, which meant we'd need to do significant clearing before we could even start on foundations. What the investors hadn't emphasized, or maybe didn't know, was the site's history. The land had been home to a tuberculosis sanatorium from 1918 until 1962, a place where people with TB were sent to either recover or die. In those days, tuberculosis was a death sentence for many, and sanatoriums were essentially holding facilities where the infected could be isolated from the general population. The buildings had been torn down in the late 60s, and nature had reclaimed the property over the following decades. But the history was still there, buried under 50 years of growth. We broke ground on a Monday in early October. The weather was perfect, that crisp autumn air that makes outdoor work bearable. My crew consisted of about 20 guys, experienced workers I'd been with for years. We started with the clearing, bringing in equipment to take down trees and remove the undergrowth. That's when the problems began. On the second day, one of my equipment operators, a guy named Santino, who'd been running bulldozers for 15 years, came to me visibly shaken. He said his machine kept stalling out in certain areas of the property, always in the same spots, despite being recently serviced and in perfect working order. He'd restart it and it would run fine for a while, then hit another cold spot and the engine would die. Cold spot was his word for it, and when I asked what he meant, he said those areas felt different. Colder, heavier, like the air was thicker there. I chalked it up to superstition and told him to work around those areas while I called the equipment rental company to have a technician come check their machinery. But over the next few days, other workers started reporting similar experiences. Tools would go missing and turn up in places no one had left them. Electrical equipment would malfunction for no reason, and everyone commented on the cold spots, these pockets of air that felt 20 degrees colder than the surrounding area, even in the afternoon sun. Then the injuries started. Nothing major at first, just the kind of accidents that happen on construction sites. A guy tripped over lumber that he swore hadn't been there a moment before. Another worker got hit by a falling board that shouldn't have fallen because it had been secured properly. Santino cut his hand on a piece of metal that appeared in his path despite the area having been cleared the day before. None of the injuries were serious, but the frequency was concerning. We were having multiple incidents every day when we'd normally go weeks without any safety issues. I held a safety meeting, went over protocols, reminded everyone to stay alert and watch out for each other. But I could see the unease in their faces. These were tough men who'd worked dangerous jobs for years, but something about this site was getting to them. They started talking among themselves, sharing experiences that went beyond equipment malfunctions and minor accidents. They were seeing things. Figures at the edges of the worksite, standing among the trees, watching us. When they'd look directly at the figures, they'd disappear, but in peripheral vision, They were clearly there. People in old-fashioned clothes, hospital gowns faded and dirty, standing perfectly still and watching our every move. I didn't see the figures myself, not at first, but I felt them. There was a presence on that property, a weight in the air that had nothing to do with weather or humidity. It felt like being watched, like standing on stage in front of an invisible audience. The feeling was strongest in certain areas, particularly in a depression in the land that had been the location of the main sanatorium building. 2 weeks into the project, we had our first serious injury. Scaffolding collapsed, sending a worker named Callahan falling 15 feet to the ground. He broke his leg in 3 places and fractured 2 ribs. The scaffolding had been inspected that morning and certified as secure. There was no reason for it to fail, but when we examined the debris, we found that bolts had been removed, support brackets had been loosened. It looked like deliberate sabotage, except we had security cameras covering the site and no one had been near that scaffolding except the workers who were using it. I called the investors and told them we had serious safety concerns. They sent their project manager, a woman named Brianna, who'd overseen dozens of developments. She walked the site with me, listened to my concerns, reviewed the incident reports. She was professional and thorough, but I could see skepticism in her eyes. Construction sites have accidents, equipment malfunctions. Workers get spooked, especially on properties with dark histories. None of this was unusual enough to halt a multi-million-dollar project. But then she experienced it herself. We were standing in the foundation excavation for the main building when the temperature dropped precipitously. I'm not talking about a cool breeze. In the span of maybe 10 seconds, it went from comfortable autumn weather to so cold we could see our breath. And then we both saw her. A woman in a stained hospital gown, standing at the edge of the excavation, looking down at us with hollow eyes. She was there for maybe 5 seconds, clear as day. And then she faded like morning mist, leaving nothing but that bone-deep cold and a smell like antiseptic and decay. Brianna didn't say anything, just walked back to her car with her arms wrapped around herself. 20 minutes later, she called me and said we were shutting down for 24 hours while she made some calls. I sent my crew home early, and that night I did some research. The sanatorium had been one of the largest in the state, capable of housing over 500 patients at its peak. Tuberculosis treatment in that era was primitive, consisting mainly of fresh air, rest, and isolation. Patients would spend months or years at the facility, and many never left. I found records showing that over 2,000 people had died at the sanatorium between 1918 and 1962. Most had been buried in a cemetery on the property, in a section of land that was now part of our development site. The next morning, Brianna arrived with a local historian, an elderly woman who'd written extensively about Asheville's medical history. The historian walked the property with us, pointing out features that were no longer visible but had been part of the sanatorium complex. The main building had stood where we were planning the largest condo structure. The isolation wards had been scattered across the hillside, and the cemetery, which according to records had been properly maintained until the facility closed, was directly under where we'd been excavating for parking and utilities. The historian said many of the patients buried there were in unmarked graves. They'd been poor, had no family, or had family who couldn't afford proper headstones. Over the decades, the cemetery had been forgotten, overgrown, lost to time and vegetation. When the property was sold in the 70s, no one had mentioned the graves. They simply weren't on any modern maps or surveys. We called in ground-penetrating radar specialists, and they confirmed what the historian suspected. The entire development site was covering burial grounds. Hundreds of graves, maybe more, scattered across our 15 acres. Some were in the documented cemetery, but others were in areas where patients had apparently been buried without official record, perhaps during epidemic years when the death rate was too high for proper documentation. Brianna made more calls. The investors, the county, the state, Historic Preservation Office. What followed was weeks of bureaucratic wrangling about what to do. You can't just build on top of grave sites, but moving human remains requires permits, family notifications where possible, archaeological oversight. The project ground to a complete halt while lawyers and officials debated. Meanwhile, my crew refused to return to the site. I didn't blame them. Word had spread about what Brianna and I had seen, about the graves we'd unknowingly been digging through, about the sanatorium's history. No amount of money was worth working on land where the dead were clearly disturbed and restless. The investors eventually hired an archaeological firm to excavate the graves properly. It took months. They found over 800 sets of remains, many in crude pine boxes that had rotted away, some with no coffins at all, just bodies that had been wrapped in sheets and buried in shallow graves. Many showed signs of tuberculosis, bones damaged by the disease, evidence of the suffering these people had endured before death. As the excavation progressed, something changed on the property. The cold spots became less frequent. The sense of being watched diminished. It was like the land itself was breathing easier, like whatever had been keeping those spirits bound there was releasing them as their remains were being treated with respect and dignity. I returned to the site several times during the archaeological work, and each visit felt different. The oppressive atmosphere was lifting. I spoke with some of the archaeologists, and they told me this wasn't uncommon. Burial grounds that had been forgotten or disrespected often generated reports of paranormal activity. Whether you believed in ghosts or not, there was something about the desecration of burial sites that left an imprint, a disturbance that people could sense even if they couldn't explain it. The project changed completely. The investors, facing public pressure and the moral weight of what had been uncovered, abandoned the condo development. Instead, they worked with the county and the Historic Preservation Society to create a memorial park. The remains were reburied in a properly maintained cemetery on part of the property, with a memorial listing the names of everyone who died at the sanatorium, as far as records could determine. The rest of the land was left as green space, with walking trails and interpretive signs explaining the site's history. I attended the dedication ceremony in the spring of 2021. It was a beautiful day, and dozens of people came out, including descendants of sanatorium patients who'd had no idea where their ancestors were buried. There were tears, prayers, and a sense of closure that had been missing for 60 years. And I noticed, standing there among the new headstones and memorial plaques, that the air felt clear. The weight was gone. The cold spots had disappeared. Whatever had been disturbed by our construction had been laid to rest properly. My crew and I never went back to work on that property, but I've driven by it several times since. The memorial park is peaceful, well-maintained, visited by people who want to remember or understand this piece of Appalachian history. And I think about those weeks we spent there, before we knew what we were building on, when the dead were trying to tell us that this land was theirs, that their rest had been disturbed, that they deserved acknowledgement and respect. I've worked on other developments since then, but I'm more careful now. I research the history of properties before we break ground. I ask questions about what stood there before, who lived there, what the land was used for, and when workers report strange experiences or equipment malfunctions in certain areas, I don't dismiss it as superstition. I listen, investigate, and proceed with caution and respect. Because that October in Asheville taught me something important. The land remembers. Burial grounds hold energy, whether you call it spiritual or psychological or something else entirely. When you build on top of forgotten graves, when you disturb the resting places of people who suffered and died and deserve dignity even in death, there are consequences. The dead don't rest easy when their graves are desecrated, and the living can't escape the weight of that disturbance. Some people think the paranormal experiences we had were just collective stress, workers feeding off each other's anxiety on a site with a dark history. Maybe that's true. I can't prove that what Brianna and I saw was really a ghost, can't provide scientific evidence that those cold spots and equipment failures were caused by supernatural forces. But I know what I felt on that property. I know the change that occurred when the remains were treated with respect. And I know that some places hold pain and memory in ways that can't be easily explained or dismissed. The sanatorium patients who were buried on that land suffered terrible deaths, isolated from their families, struggling to breathe as tuberculosis destroyed their lungs, dying slowly in a facility that was as much prison as hospital. They were buried in unmarked graves, forgotten by a society that wanted to pretend tuberculosis didn't exist, didn't want to remember the thousands who died from it. For 60 years, they lay under that ground with no acknowledgement, no memorial, no recognition that they'd ever existed. Is it any wonder that when we came with our bulldozers and excavators, planning to build luxury condos for wealthy retirees on top of their graves, something pushed back? Is it surprising that the land itself seemed to resist our presence, that workers felt watched and threatened, that accidents happened with disturbing frequency? I don't claim to understand the mechanism, don't know if what we experienced was literally ghosts or some kind of environmental memory or collective psychological response to a place saturated with death and suffering. But I know it was real. I know those cold spots existed. That scaffolding failed without mechanical explanation. That Brianna and I both saw the same figure on the same day in the same place. And I know that after the remains were properly excavated and reburied, after the memorial was built and the dead were finally acknowledged and honored, the disturbances stopped. The land became peaceful. The memorial park has had no reports of paranormal activity, no cold spots, no figures in hospital gowns watching from the trees. That tells me something. It tells me that what the dead wanted wasn't to haunt or harm, but simply to be remembered, to have their suffering acknowledged, to rest in graves that were marked and maintained and respected. Once we gave them that, once we treated them with the dignity they deserved, they were content to rest. I'm a construction foreman, not a philosopher or a theologian, but that experience in Asheville changed how I think about the work I do. Every piece of land has history. Every development site was something before it was vacant property ready for construction. And sometimes that history deserves more than being bulldozed and paved over. Sometimes the dead deserve more than being forgotten, and the living owe them the respect of remembering. The Memorial Park in Asheville stands as a testament to over 2,000 people who suffered and died from tuberculosis in the early 20th century. Their names are inscribed in stone now, their graves properly maintained, their stories told to visitors who walk the trails and read the interpretive signs. It's not the luxury condo development the investors planned, but it's something more important. It's acknowledgement. It's respect. It's the living taking responsibility for honoring the dead. And it's proof that sometimes, when you listen to the land and pay attention to what it's trying to tell you, you can transform something disturbing and tragic into something meaningful and peaceful. Those patients can finally rest now, their suffering remembered rather than buried and forgotten. And that, I've come to believe, is what they wanted all along. My name is Bradley, and I'm 26 years old. I work as a forestry technician for the U.S. Forest Service in the Cherokee National Forest, covering Monroe County in eastern Tennessee. My job involves conducting wildlife surveys, monitoring ecological health, and documenting changes in the forest ecosystem. It's solitary work that requires spending days alone in remote areas, hiking trails that most people will never see, camping in places where cell phone signals don't reach. I've always been comfortable in the wilderness, always felt at home among the trees. That confidence lasted until April 2016, when I went into the forest for a routine survey and came back 3 days later with no memory of 2 of them, with photographs I don't remember taking, and with the certainty that I was no longer alone even when I thought I was. The survey assignment was straightforward. I needed to document wildlife activity along a 10-mile section of forest in an area that hadn't been assessed in over 5 years. I packed my gear on a Monday morning, drove to the trailhead, and started hiking into the backcountry. The weather was perfect, that beautiful spring weather when everything is blooming and the forest feels alive. I had my GPS unit, my camera equipment, my camping gear, and enough supplies for 3 days. I've done this kind of work dozens of times. There was no reason to think this trip would be any different from all the others. I was about 4 miles in, maybe 2 hours into my hike, when I first noticed I was being followed. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling at first. That awareness you get when you're being watched, when you're not as alone as you should be. I stopped and listened, scanning the forest around me. Nothing visible, no sounds that didn't belong, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step I took deeper into the woods. Around midday, I stopped to eat lunch and check my GPS coordinates. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, matching my own rhythm, coming from somewhere behind me. I'd walk, they'd walk, I'd stop, they'd stop. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just empty forest, trees and undergrowth, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or bear tracking me out of curiosity. But the footsteps sounded wrong for an animal. They sounded deliberate, bipedal, human. I continued my survey work, trying to focus on the job despite the growing unease. I photographed tracks, documented signs of wildlife activity, made notes in my field journal. But the entire time I could feel that presence behind me, keeping pace, staying just out of sight. By late afternoon, I was ready to make camp for the night. I found a suitable spot near a stream, set up my tent, built a small fire. The normal routines of wilderness camping that usually brought me peace felt different this time. The forest felt wrong somehow, the shadows too deep, the silence too complete. As darkness fell, the presence became more obvious. I could hear movement circling my camp, staying just beyond the reach of my firelight. Not random animal movement, but deliberate pacing, like something was studying me, evaluating me. I sat by the fire with my back against a tree, trying to appear calm while my heart raced. Whatever was out there stayed all night, circling, watching, never quite revealing itself. I didn't sleep. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up my camp as quickly as possible and started hiking back toward my truck. The survey could wait. Whatever was in these woods with me, I wanted out. But when I checked my GPS to navigate back to the trailhead, something was wrong. The coordinates didn't make sense. According to the GPS, I was 3 miles north of where I should be, in a section of forest I hadn't hiked through. But that was impossible. I knew where I'd camped. I'd followed the trail markers. I started hiking in what should have been the direction of the trailhead, but nothing looked right. Landmarks I'd passed on the way in weren't where they should be. The trail itself seemed different, winding in directions that didn't match my memory. And the GPS kept showing me in wrong locations, coordinates that jumped around impossibly, placing me miles away from where I physically was. The presence was still there, still following, but closer now. I could catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that disappeared when I looked directly at them. The forest felt like it was shifting around me, paths appearing and disappearing, the landscape refusing to hold still. I walked for hours, my GPS becoming increasingly erratic, my sense of direction completely gone. That's the last clear memory I have of that day. The next thing I remember with any certainty is waking up in my truck at the trailhead, dawn light filtering through the windshield. I was in the driver's seat, fully dressed in my hiking gear, my equipment scattered in the back. My head felt foggy, my body exhausted in a way that went beyond normal fatigue. I checked my watch. It was Thursday morning. I'd lost 2 entire days. I drove straight to the ranger station feeling like I was going to be sick. I reported what I remembered, that I'd felt followed, that I'd gotten disoriented, that I'd somehow lost time. My supervisor was concerned but practical. Dehydration and exhaustion could cause confusion, disorientation. He sent me to the hospital to get checked out. The doctors ran tests, found nothing wrong except that I was severely dehydrated and sleep-deprived. They kept me overnight for observation, gave me fluids, told me I was lucky I'd made it back to my truck safely. But I knew something was wrong, something the doctors couldn't find in blood tests or physical exams. When I got home and started going through my equipment, I found things that made my skin crawl. My camera had over 200 photographs on it that I didn't remember taking. Most were normal. Survey shots, the kind I'd taken hundreds of times. But scattered among them were others. Photographs that couldn't be right. There were pictures of me sleeping. Dozens of them, taken from different angles, different distances. Me in my sleeping bag inside my tent, photographed from an angle that should have been impossible because my tent was closed. Me lying on the ground in places I didn't recognize, in positions that looked wrong, unnatural. And the timestamps on the photos showed they'd been taken throughout the 2 days I couldn't remember, during times when my camera should have been in my backpack, when I should have been the only person capable of operating it. The final photographs were the worst. They showed my truck, taken from inside the forest, showing me sitting in the driver's seat before I woke up Thursday morning. The angle was from about 20 feet away, slightly elevated, and as if whoever took the photos had been up in a tree, watching me sleep in my vehicle. The timestamp was 6:43 a.m. Thursday, about 15 minutes before I'd regained consciousness. I reported everything to my supervisor, showed him the photographs. He looked through them without speaking, his face growing paler with each image. He asked if I had any history of sleepwalking, of dissociative episodes, of any mental health issues that might explain photographing myself without remembering it. I told him no, told him I'd never done anything like that I couldn't explain the photos any more than I could explain the missing 2 days. The Forest Service launched an investigation. They interviewed me multiple times, examined my equipment, sent rangers back to search the area where I'd been working. They found my first campsite easily enough, found evidence I'd been there. But they also found other campsites, 3 of them, scattered across several miles of forest, sites where someone had made fires, had trampled the ground, had clearly spent time. And at each site, they found my boot prints, only my prints. No evidence of anyone else, no explanation for who could have taken those photographs. The investigation concluded that I'd experienced some kind of fugue state, possibly brought on by dehydration or exhaustion, during which I'd wandered the forest for 2 days, taking photographs I didn't remember. The official report was sympathetic but clear. I needed psychological evaluation before I could return to fieldwork. I was placed on administrative leave, pending clearance from a psychiatrist. I saw 3 different mental health professionals. All of them asked the same questions, probed for signs of dissociation, memory disorders, psychotic breaks. None of them found anything definitively wrong. I wasn't psychotic, wasn't dissociative, wasn't suffering from any diagnosable condition that would explain what happened. But they all agreed I'd experienced significant trauma, that whatever happened in those woods had left psychological scars, even if I couldn't remember the events that caused them. I never went back to fieldwork, took a desk job with the Forest Service, analyzing data other people collected, staying safely in the office where nothing could follow me. But the experience didn't end when I left the forest. For months afterward, I'd find things that suggested I wasn't done being watched. Photos on my phone I didn't remember taking, showing my apartment from angles that suggested someone had been inside while I slept. My car would be parked slightly differently than I'd left it, moved maybe a few inches, just enough to notice. Objects in my home would be rearranged subtly, nothing obvious, just small changes that accumulated over time. I've moved twice since then, changed my phone number, installed security cameras in my apartment. The cameras have never captured anything unusual, but I still feel watched sometimes. Still feel that same presence I felt in the forest. Like whatever followed me in those woods, followed me out, followed me home, and never really left. I've tried to research similar experiences, looking for other people who've reported being followed in the Cherokee National Forest, who've lost time or found inexplicable photographs. I found a few scattered reports online, people describing similar feelings of being tracked, of losing time in the woods, of finding evidence they'd been places they didn't remember going, but nothing concrete, nothing that explained what actually happens in those woods or what's doing the following. The rational part of my brain wants to believe the official explanation, that I had some kind of breakdown, that stress and isolation caused a psychological episode where I did things I couldn't later remember. But that doesn't explain the photographs taken from angles I couldn't have achieved, from positions where my camera couldn't have been. It doesn't explain how I could have set up the camera to photograph myself sleeping from 20 feet away and then return to my sleeping position without waking up. And it doesn't explain the feeling I still have, 6 years later, that something is watching me, that whatever I encountered in the Cherokee National Forest in April 2016 hasn't let me go, continues to track me, continues to document me the way I was documenting wildlife. Like I've become the subject of someone else's survey, studied, and photographed by something that exists just outside my ability to perceive it directly. I don't go into forests anymore, can't stand being among trees, feeling that vulnerability of being watched from unseen positions. I stay in cities now, surrounded by people and buildings and the comforting buzz of civilization. But even here, in the middle of Knoxville, surrounded by thousands of people, I sometimes feel it. That presence just behind me, just outside my vision, watching and waiting and documenting every moment of my life in ways I'll never understand or escape. My name is Banks, and I'm 55 years old. I work as a social worker for the North Carolina Department of Social Services, and for the past 27 years, I've been investigating reports of child welfare concerns across the western part of the state. I've seen poverty, neglect, abuse, and every shade of family dysfunction you can imagine. I thought I'd developed a thick skin, thought nothing could surprise me anymore. Then in June 2003, I received a report about a religious community in Boone, Watauga County, and I discovered that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are the ones people build inside their own minds, and sometimes the cruelest abusers are the ones who smile while they destroy you. The report came from a school counselor who'd met with a teenage girl during the last week of the school year. The girl, whose name was Phoebe, had slipped the counselor a note asking for help, but then immediately recanted when confronted, claiming she'd written it as a joke. The counselor didn't believe it was a joke. She'd noticed things about Phoebe over the school year, the way she never quite made eye contact, never laughed, or showed spontaneous emotion, spoke in a measured, careful way that seemed rehearsed. And she'd noticed similar behaviors in other students from the same community, a religious group that lived in a compound about 15 miles outside of Boone. I drove out to the compound on a Thursday afternoon. The property was extensive, maybe 200 acres of mountain land with several buildings scattered across it. A main lodge, smaller cabins, a large barn that appeared to serve as a meeting hall. Everything was meticulously maintained, clean and orderly in a way that spoke of rigid discipline. I was met at the gate by a man named Russell, who introduced himself as the community's spiritual leader. He was in his 60s, soft-spoken and courteous, with a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. That should have been my first warning. Russell welcomed me warmly, said they had nothing to hide, that I was free to look around and speak with anyone I wanted. He gave me a tour of the facilities, explained their beliefs, their practices, their commitment to raising children in a godly environment, free from the corrupting influences of modern society. Everything he said sounded reasonable, even admirable. The buildings were clean, the children appeared healthy and well-fed, everyone I met was polite and articulate. But something was wrong. I couldn't identify it at first, couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me. Then I realized it was the sameness. Everyone spoke in similar patterns, used similar phrases, moved with similar measured grace. The children especially seemed identical in their behavior, standing with the same posture, responding to questions with the same careful consideration, smiling with the same fixed expression that never quite reached their eyes. I asked to speak with Phoebe privately. Russell agreed, immediately, which surprised me. Most communities like this would be defensive, would resist any suggestion of problems. But Russell led me to a small room in the main lodge and brought Phoebe to me, leaving us alone without hesitation. Phoebe sat across from me with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, and that same measured smile on her face. I asked her about the note. She denied writing it, said it must have been a misunderstanding, that she was very happy in the community. Her words were appropriate, but her delivery was wrong. She spoke like someone reciting lines they'd memorized, with no emotional inflection, no natural variation in tone or rhythm. I pressed gently, asking about her daily life, her relationships, her feelings. Every answer was positive. Every description painted a picture of perfect contentment. But her eyes were empty. She was performing happiness, not feeling it. I spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing other children, always with Russell's cheerful permission, always in private rooms where they could speak freely. Every conversation was the same. Perfect answers, measured responses, that fixed smile that looked more like a mask than genuine emotion. None of them ever laughed spontaneously, never fidgeted or showed normal childhood energy, never deviated from careful, scripted responses. The adults were similar, but more polished. They'd been performing longer, had perfected the presentation. They spoke lovingly about the community, about Russell's wisdom and guidance, about how blessed they were to live according to God's true principles. But underneath the words, I sensed the same emptiness I'd seen in the children's eyes, like they were all reading from the same script, playing roles in a performance with no room for improvisation or authentic feeling. I left the compound that evening with a detailed report, but no concrete evidence of abuse. The children were physically healthy, adequately educated through the community's homeschool program, and showed no signs of neglect or physical mistreatment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening there, something more insidious than bruises or malnutrition. I dug deeper, researched the community's history, talked to former members who'd left over the years. What I learned was disturbing. The community practiced something they called spiritual rebirth, an intensive process of breaking down a person's previous identity and rebuilding them according to the community's ideals. New members, including children born into the community, underwent constant indoctrination. They were taught that individual thoughts and feelings were manifestations of sin, that true godliness meant complete submission to Russell's interpretation of divine will. Children were raised in a system of total control. Every aspect of their lives was regulated, from what they ate to how they stood, to what facial expressions were appropriate in different situations. Spontaneous emotion was punished as evidence of spiritual weakness. Independent thought was treated as rebellion against God. By the time they reached adolescence, they'd been so thoroughly programmed that they couldn't conceive of themselves as separate individuals with their own desires or beliefs. Former members described the process with horror. One woman, who'd escaped in her 20s, told me she'd spent years learning how to feel emotions again, how to have thoughts that weren't Russell's thoughts echoing in her head. She described the community as a prison built from words and beliefs, where the bars were invisible but stronger than steel. And she told me that children born into the system had it worst, because they never knew anything else, never had a baseline of normalcy to compare against the indoctrination. Armed with this information, I petitioned for the removal of 3 children, including Phoebe, on grounds of psychological abuse. The case went to court, and I testified about what I'd observed, about the systematic destruction of individual identity, about the erasure of authentic emotion and independent thought. But the community had lawyers, good ones, who argued persuasively about religious freedom, parental rights, and the lack of physical harm. The judge, sympathetic to arguments about government overreach into religious communities, ruled in the community's favor. The children were returned. I appealed the decision, but the appeals process took months, and during that time the community closed ranks. They stopped allowing outside visitors, pulled the children from any contact with public institutions, disappeared into their compound behind locked gates and no trespassing signs. By the time my appeal was heard and denied, those children were completely unreachable. That was over 20 years ago. I've followed the community as best I could over the decades, but they've become increasingly isolated, increasingly secretive. Phoebe would be in her 30s now, if she's still there. I think about her sometimes, wonder if she ever found a way out, if she ever discovered who she might have been without the constant programming and control. But I suspect she's still there, still performing the role she was taught, still smiling that fixed smile that hides the absence of a genuine self underneath. The worst part came 15 years after my initial investigation. I was at a community outreach event in Boone when a young woman approached me. She was in her early 20s, well-dressed, articulate, warm. She introduced herself and said she worked for a nonprofit that helped families find faith-based communities. She asked if I knew any families who might be interested in her services. As we talked, something about her manner struck me as familiar. The careful way she spoke, the measured quality of her expressions, the way her smile didn't quite connect with her eyes. I asked where she'd grown up, and she told me about a wonderful, religious community where she'd been raised in accordance with God's principles. When she named the community, my blood ran cold. It was Russell's compound. She was recruiting. They'd sent her out into the world, polished and presentable, to find new families, new children, to bring back into their system. The cycle was continuing, expanding, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I reported what I'd learned to my supervisors, to law enforcement, to anyone who would listen. But without evidence of specific crimes, without victims willing to testify, there was no basis for action. The community operated within legal boundaries, exploiting religious freedom protections to maintain their isolated system of psychological control. And they were patient, playing the long game, gradually growing their numbers while staying just beneath the threshold of official intervention. I retired last year, but the case still haunts me. I failed those children, failed Phoebe specifically, failed to protect her from a system that erased her personality and replaced it with a programmed set of responses. I see her sometimes in my nightmares, that fixed smile on her face, that emptiness in her eyes, asking me for help in a note she'd deny writing the moment she was confronted. The community is still there, still operating, still raising children in an environment of total psychological control. Russell died a few years ago, but his successor continues the same practices, maintains the same system. And somewhere in that compound, Phoebe might still be there, in her 30s now, perhaps raising her own children in the same system that destroyed her ability to be an authentic human being. That's what keeps me awake at night. Not just what was done to her, but what she might now be doing to the next generation. The cycle of abuse perpetuating itself, victims becoming perpetrators not through malice, but through the complete inability to conceive of any other way of being. That's the true horror of systematic indoctrination. It doesn't just damage individuals. It turns them into tools for damaging others, spreading the trauma across generations, until no one remembers what authentic humanity even looks like. I'm telling this story now because I want people to understand that abuse doesn't always leave visible scars, that the most effective prisons are the ones built inside people's minds, that religious freedom, as important as it is, can be weaponized to protect systematic psychological destruction, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who smile gently and speak softly about love and God while methodically erasing everything that makes their victims human. If you encounter communities like this, if you see children who speak in scripted phrases and smile with empty eyes, please don't look away. Please don't accept assurances that everything is fine just because there are no bruises. Psychological abuse is real abuse. Identity erasure is real harm. And children trapped in these systems need advocates who will fight for them even when the legal system fails to recognize the invisible violence being done to their minds and souls. Thank you for watching Bleak Fears. These stories from Appalachia remind us that true horror often wears a familiar face and hides in places we'd never think to look. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes those secrets find their way out. If these stories unsettled you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share your own Appalachian encounters in the comments below. Until next time, remember that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Stay vigilant out there.